Utopia, Science, Action. From the 25th to the 27th of April, as announced in the letter to Comrades N35, a meeting was held at Rome in 1997 with a day dedicated to meeting our readers. Letter to Comrades number 37 of Quinterna. Translated by Balance Y. Avant. A general presentation on the nature of our activity preceded other concatenated presentations on the impossibility of separating revolutionary theory and practice. Focusing on the opening passage of the chapter Proletarians and Communists of Marx's Manifesto, the presentation sought to demonstrate how we must avoid the nefarious and unfortunately generalized practice that is always based on the attempt to reverse by one's own will the determinations that are the cause of the present situation. A second presentation, which started from the demonstration of how even the classical utopias could not escape the material determinations due to the epoch in which they were produced, developed around just two important quotations from Marx, the anti-utopian and materialist thesis that the militant of the communist revolution does not arouse but is part of the real movement of communism. Hence the consequent action in harmony with the historical party and the immense wealth of experience accumulated in the historical clash between classes. Again intending to demonstrate that adherence to the communist program is practical work, the only work that can be defined as being in harmony with correct Marxist praxis, we then continued in the afternoon with two examples of the so-called analysis of situations. The first, which we can consider as a contribution to the classic left meetings on the course of capitalism, traced the dynamics of the geo-historical areas around which the activity of world capital is polarized. This study constitutes an initial framework of a broader work intended to define the state of health and the lines of development of the economic, social and military contradictions of world imperialism. The other dealt with a problem that is besetting the bourgeoisie and is commonly referred to as the end of work. Since this is a summary of some meetings held earlier this year, some parts have been summarized, while we postpone the more extensive use of numerical examples and documentation to a later work. The report started from an investigation around the Marxist categories related to the increase in productivity, which is synonymous with the increase in the social productive force of labor, to the evidence of the maturity necessity of communism. Practical work. This meeting has been called for readers who follow the work of the internationalist notebooks. We therefore consider it more useful to give a general overview of the characteristics of our work than to list what has been done over the years. The first thing to stress here is that the internationalist notebooks reject the praxis that characterizes most political groups. What is the praxis we are referring to? The praxis according to which the will replaces the conditions that are lacking. Let us give some examples. The party disintegrates. Then it is immediately theorized that a new party must be created. Is there a lack of homogeneity among comrades? Then the comrades decide at the table that this homogeneity must be created. This is exactly the reverse of how things should be approached from a deterministic point of view. Linked to this problem, there are several factors. The first is what it means to found a party, to be a party, or what it means to work with a party method when the party itself is not there. Also, the relationship between repetition and elaboration. This is one of the central themes of the communist left. When one speaks of continuity, one also speaks, inextricably, of continuation. Repetition, in itself, is also done by parrots. It is not something that characterizes the work of a political organ. Elaboration from scratch is a current trait of all opportunists, of those who wake up one day and decide that they have done some genius thinking with respect to the revolution and its course. Both are clearly not suitable, not adequate for the tasks the revolution poses. In addressing this issue, let us go directly to the Naples Theses. In these theses it is stated precisely, unequivocally that if in the physical world there is nothing firm, nothing immutable, let alone in the social field, in the field of revolution. In tune with what was stated in the Theses of Naples, Bordiga grasps, in the series of 136 articles called On the Thread of Time, the historical dynamic that binds all events together, explaining the present through the past and the future. We will return to this concept of historical dynamics several times, because it is the only correct way to approach the analysis of capitalism and all scientific procedures in general. The communist left was, without a shadow of a doubt, the one that systematized the path that led to the degeneration of the Third International, which provided a gigantic theoretical apparatus to explain what happened. In this sense, it can be said that the communist left has gone far beyond the results achieved by the Second Congress, which, in our opinion, remains the highest point so far expressed in the communist movement. Why the Italian left and not the German left or, more generally, the front that opposed the degenerative process? We must, first of all, examine what kind of characteristics Italy has. It is the oldest capitalist country, a laboratory for experiments that had fertile ground here and then went on to establish themselves definitively wherever the situation allowed. It is no coincidence that it was in Italy where fascism was first established and where the communist left was born, fascism on the bourgeois side, the communist left on the proletarian side. We were saying, why the Italian left and not others? The Russian Revolution had a dual character and was therefore easily mystified. It was a democratic revolution and at the same time proletarian. One could confuse language, tactics, etc. The German Revolution already had in it the germs of its own negation. It spoke of realizing democracy instead of overcoming it. It spoke of the spontaneity of the masses instead of the centralized party as the organ of revolution. It affirmed decentralized councils instead of vigorously supporting the proletarian state. In this panorama, the communist left is the one that, on the other hand, was born in perfect continuity with the historical experience that, starting with the Paris Commune, asserted itself not only as the experience of a revolution maturing in Europe, but as the theoretical and political synthesis of the eras that would lead to the degeneration of the Third International. This degeneration is at the same time counter-revolution, but the latter is dialectically the other side of revolution. Counter-revolution exists against something that equally exists. The concept of the historical party is this: revolution always and in any case exists precisely because there is the real movement that goes progressively, albeit not linearly but in leaps and bounds, towards higher forms. The historical party, in the sense used by Marx, always exists to the extent that there is this real movement, but surely the militants are the physical instruments of revolution. Marx said that in certain situations the historical party can only be found in a library, but it is men who take these books out of the library and use them, it is men who make themselves the physical instruments of revolution. And on this, indeed on this too, Bourdieu gave precise answers. In 1950 he replied to a comrade's letter explaining how he meant military. He tells him that his problem is not so much that of being a soldier, something he has always done, but that of not generalizing on a troop that does not even have a sense of the Gewitter and that the revolution will come, he continues, when the militants will get over the mania of the fatherless, when theory will stop thinking that they have bought a ticket to the revolution. The true militant is the one who lets himself be used by the revolution, that is, who becomes an instrument of it. He is the one who understands its mechanism so that he does not think he is part of a grouping of people capable of moving things forward through action, but understands that he will be suited to the demands imposed by the revolution by immersing himself in it and going along with it. At least until there is a centralized political force charged with the authority provided by material facts capable of enforcing the political will of the proletariat as a class. This concept, which is extremely important, is not only not understood by many, but we have seen that a practice exactly contrary to what we are saying is the norm. We must have a sense of measure and realize what we are at the moment and therefore not be afraid to say that we, the communist movement in its generality, express almost absolute zero in the face of the tasks that the situation would demand. What we say does not mean surrender to resignation or waiting, it means, we say it again, trying to be as adequate as possible. We have repeatedly criticized the party conception according to which, starting from an organized embryo, formal organization develops into an adult body. This follows the biological conception of a living being that is born and develops according to a code that is imprinted in its genetic nature. Our conception of the party is different. First of all, the formation and development of a social organism are much more complex, they result from a constant interaction that this organism has with its environment. In the article Activism, Bourdieu emphasizes that the party and revolution, conceptually understood, can never be separated. Why? It is clearly stated, there is no revolutionary situation if there is no revolutionary party, you cannot call a situation revolutionary if there is no party. There are theories we hear echoed every day, which argue, the objective conditions are ripe, the party is missing, there is a delay in the class struggle. Evidently, these theories do not follow dialectics, but the application of a pedestrian logic. This is a gradualist and mechanistic conception that does not accord with a global vision of historical becoming. We believe, and let it be said once again, there is nothing original in what we assert, we read reality according to the scientific theory that guides us, Marxism, that history unfolds differently, and social relations are difficult to fit into a given pattern. According to a general scheme, we know that there is an accumulation of continuous contradictions that express themselves in a discontinued solution, hence in sudden social contrasts and, at the limit, according to the classical alternative, either revolution or war. We said at the beginning, we work in a party method without being a party. This sounds like a somewhat abstruse formula, but in reality it is basically simple to understand what it is trying to summarize. It means that we do our work without putting our heads together. Or at least we try to. The risk of falling into individual or group personalism is an ever-lurking danger, a generalized phenomenon in an age of putrescent capitalism. Against it, in addition to the doctrine that has always contemplated, from Marx onwards, a tough fight against that clappers, we need a good dose of collective common sense. We try to do our work as best we can, and we can know if and how much we succeed, in short to have the pulse of the situation, the more our readers, all comrades, follow us with their stimuli and criticism. We try to do our work aware of the limitations both ours and those imposed by the situation, in the conviction of all that we have said before. Certainly, we do not do as others do, who think and behave as if they were a real party, as if they had connections with the masses, etc. This kind of attitude damages not only those who take it on in the immediate term, but, and this is what we care about most, the communist movement's chances of future expression. Propaganda, proselytizing, are not missionary activities, and our word is not a religion for initiates. Marxism is a scientific theory of historical processes, it does not allow us to confront it with particular positions, which are then always opinions. Our work is not work for a cause. We do not think of communism as an ideal goal to be achieved. We leave the ideal to anarchists and utopians. Communism is not a goal to be achieved, it is a real movement to overcome the present state of affairs. Regarding this phrase, that is often used as an advertising slogan in the orgy of trivializations about communism, we would like to read a few sentences from the paragraph Proletarians and Communists from the 1848 Manifesto. What relation passes between communists and proletarians in general? Communists do not constitute a particular party in relation to the other workers' parties. They have no interests distinct from the interests of the proletariat as a whole. They do not erect particular principles on which they want to model the proletarian movement. Communists are distinguished from other proletarian parties only by the fact that, on the one hand, in the various national struggles of the proletariat, they emphasize and assert those common interests of the entire proletariat that are independent of nationality, on the other hand, by the fact that, in the various stages of development that the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie goes through, they always represent the interest of the movement as a whole. The theoretical positions of the communists do not rest at all on ideas, on principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that renewer of the world. They are merely general expressions of the actual relations of a class struggle that already exists, of a historical movement unfolding before our eyes. Communists are part of a movement that already exists, that is independent of our will, that has a historical becoming that we can fully understand if, precisely, we see the whole series of facts from the past to the future. Let us take an example. In 1985, our first notebook entitled The Historical Crisis of Aging Capitalism was published. In the preface, we essentially wanted to address a question of method. The question of the party was not stated as a restatement of the need for organization, a need that everyone has, we would miss it if it were not so, but was addressed from the point of view of historical dynamics. This dynamic saw progressively, a term to be understood not as gradualism but as a series of discontinuous solutions proceeding by leaps and bounds, the first workers' associations, the League of Communists, the concept of the historical party in the meaning and synthesis given by Marx, the first, second and third internationals, until arriving at the single world party and the organic centralism advocated by the communist left. But, mind you, organic centralism is not the new organizational idol, it is not a recipe, something we have in the cookbook for which we just have to weigh the necessary amount of ingredients to have a tasty dish. Organic centralism should be understood as a result of a material process that makes forms change towards higher organizational needs. Returning, we see, is the concept of adequacy, of the suitability of instruments for the needs of the revolution. This vision of organic centralism is set out precisely both in Party and Class of 1921 and in outline of form. In the introduction to the Quaderno cited above, again with regard to addressing issues by situating them in a historical dynamic, there is the famous example, which many of us will already be familiar with, of photography and cinematography, which Bordiga uses in Property and Capital. Photography captures an aspect at a given moment but cannot, of course, capture the sequence of the event. Cinematography progressively collects images in reciprocal interaction. The dynamics of capitalism understood as a mode of production that has an arrow in time, its emergence, its development, its survival crisis, expresses its transience, etc., implies that one studies not only the mechanism of accumulation and the troubles it causes, but also the attempt of the bourgeois class to cope with this kind of trouble. Closely linked to this attempt is the role of opportunism, especially in the West, the difficulty for the proletariat to shake off this tutelage, the phenomenon of the working class aristocracy, addressed by Lenin in Imperialism, which has deep roots. One cannot understand modern society unless one investigates the nature of these roots. This is not a purely epistemological question. Knowledge of phenomena implies that the knowing subject abstracts from the too many complications that a very complex society throws in its way. Marxist science is all-encompassing, but it knows how to discern between fundamentals invariant and a white noise, i.e. the chaotic jumble of the byproducts of accumulation. Any study of the course of world capitalism must therefore not start from a static view of events, as we have already said, but from a global vision that also implies the maturing of class relations. Obviously, there is a risk in this path of putting too much on the table and thus causing confusion. The way to try to avoid this is to start from the basis of our reference system, the law of value, and from there, by successive approximations, at an ever lower level of abstraction, arrive at what is called the Minute Chronicle, but which is in fact the mirror of profound contradictions. In the letter to comrades entitled Illinois 18 Brumaio del Partito che non c'è, the 18th Brumaire of the party that isn't there, Italian politics is addressed within the framework of the capitalist crisis and the measures the bourgeoisie is forced to take. There is no choice, there is a path that is already mapped out. The First World War produced Keynesianism, 1929 enforced it, the Second World War eliminated the unattractive aspects of fascism, the post-war period enshrined it in a new, more or less democratic fascism. There is, therefore, the bourgeoisie's need to free the executive from all parliamentary dictates and codicils. Incidentally, the need is not new. Since the last century, the bourgeoisie has been trying to disengage the executive from parliamentary chatter, and Marx not only did not get indignant or whine about threatened democracy, which is all the rage today, especially on the left, but greeted it with the famous cry, "Well dug, old mole." There is no downward curve of capitalism. Its dynamic is constantly rising, and that is precisely its deadly contradiction. There is no stopping the development of the productive forces because every capitalist does not give a damn if modernizing his factory lowers the general profit rate. He has the problem of making money and thus increasing the scale of his production. The rise of the productive forces has an immediate reflection on class relations. The liberal democratic apparatus must give way to the most modern forms of fascism precisely because above individual capitalists the system as a whole no longer tolerates generalized individual initiative. Labor power must be regulated within this framework and trade unions must be the conduit of social consensus and regulation of the buying and selling of this labor power. This has been the demand of the bourgeoisie for more than a century, and Marx addresses the same problem in his 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. The maturation of capitalism knows no pause. Class relations, on the other hand, must mature in a certain sense. We often speak of the apathy of the masses. This is undoubtedly the result of the passivity to which they have been accustomed for decades, but it probably also expresses the rejection of parliamentary practice. We need to understand what effect the ongoing movement that will lead to the demise of capitalism has on things today. The revolution will not have constructive, but destructive tasks. It is not a question of inventing, of building a new society, it is a question of freeing the productive forces from the chains in which they are harnessed. The foundations, the elements on which the new mode of production, the new social organization is based, are already present in the present one. And it is on these bases that our praxis as communists is founded. If we forget them, there is no scientific basis for labor, there is no material for the communist program, which, if we look closely, is synonymous with the project. The revolution, therefore, must eliminate all obstacles to the unfolding of the forces crushed today by bourgeois society. Revolution as a political fact does not invent anything, it frees from the shackles, as Marx says, the forces responsible for the qualitative leap that, we repeat, are already present. This is the left's main argument, found in practically all texts. This fundamental argument could not yet be taken up either by the Russians as they had not yet arrived at an unfolded capitalism, or by the Germans who were immersed in a young capitalism in which classes still in the vigor of their growth clashed. We referred earlier to those moralizing, vindicating conceptions of communism. What are they? Those theorizations that speak of the undiminished fruit of labor, that cry scandal because there is no social justice, because there is exploitation, and so on. In our view, these theorizations kill Marxism as much, and perhaps worse than Stalinism did, paralyzing Marxism and reducing it to a vindictive, syndicalist, moralistic movement. The party becomes an ammunition of the defense of something that should have been its rightful claim. Marx, already in the manuscripts, ripped apart this legal conception of the class struggle. We pose the question of militant labor, of organization in the light of what has just been stated. Propaganda against the rich, the revolution becoming a kind of proletarian coup d'état, communism understood, depending on the moment, as the proletarian paradise or as the nemesis of the victorious proletariat, arguments that, although used in the propaganda of primitive socialism, are not scientifically acceptable and must be banished. Another formula of the left is, one does not make parties and revolutions, but one directs parties and revolutions. That is, one acts on phenomena that are placed on the agenda by material facts. In this sense, one does not prepare the revolution, reduced to the status of a meeting, but one orients and directs the forces capable of overthrowing capitalism. Revolution and organization are results of the action of all classes. The class boundaries are indefinite and only at certain moments, the discontinuous solution mentioned earlier, do they polarize into two blocks with absolutely opposing interests to defend, making social confrontation inevitable. In this situation, one class tries to defend the existing order, the other tries to subvert it. In this way, the proletariat no longer acts in defense of a particular, but general interest. The bourgeoisie, in carrying out its revolution, acted in the name of all classes. The proletariat will be the last class in history and will act in the name of all humanity. One last point before closing. We have mentioned invariance several times. From a political point of view, let us omit the other scientific properties of the term here. Invariance nails us to the laws discovered by Marx on the functioning of the capitalist mode of production and their validity as long as capitalism exists. Immediately as a consequence of this, invariance is an instrument of political struggle against the updaters, the deniers, the revisionists. Another aspect of invariance is the link that prevents the separation of the repetition of Marxist concepts from the elaboration on them. If one wants to make good use of materialism, one must be able to handle the same formula that is repeated in the calculation of, say, the volume of a cube that, although it changes size under the effect of forces over time, always remains itself. We dwelt at the beginning of this speech on the relationship that indissolubly binds, for the left, these two elements of communist praxis, and with this we close it. We metaphorically close the circle, where each part is inextricably linked to the whole and cannot be analyzed in its essence except in relation to the other elements that make up this whole. Organicity is the key to understanding all Marxist theory, and the left has shown throughout its history that it has exactly understood and applied it. Utopia, Science and Action. We will divide this report into two parts, each based on a quotation from Marx. These are only two references, but we consider them important to explain from a very practical point of view what happens in a revolutionary process. So the real theme will be the praxis of revolutionaries in the actual process of revolution as Marx describes it. With this we are of course speaking out against the too many loose interpretations that have come after him. Since the communist revolution is not the only one in human history, we will deal with the invariance between revolutions and inrevolutions, the latter sometimes referred to as the revolutionary tradition. We will therefore speak of tradition, which is conservation, at the same time as we will speak of rupture, which is revolution. Part 1, From Utopia to Science. Conservation and destruction. Everyone knows that the left has been accused of making great theory but of failing to connect this theory to practice. Of being wait and see, in short. And since we take the left's heritage as equals and make it our own, we naturally inherit the accusation as well without getting too upset at this giant nonsense. We, in the invariance of Marxism and criticism of it, have consciously immersed ourselves, and it is for this reason that we gladly deal with it. Certain attitudes that humanity takes towards its problems are constant throughout history. They are certainly transformed by the passage of time, but always perfectly recognizable through materialist observation. This is because materialism makes it possible to see behind the attitudes of men the physical drives, the structure of behavior. And every physical drive derives from the actual development of society, from the development of productive forces. In this development lie the aspects that interest us, those that tend to break the old forms when they become an intolerable hindrance. Earlier the comrade quoted probably the most important passage from Marx's manifesto, where he says that communists represent the real movement that abolishes the present state of affairs. Not probably, but without a shadow of a doubt, this passage has not been understood by the communist movement in general. Paraphrasing a famous phrase, we can say that in the mid-19th century Marx shouted so loudly that all his followers went deaf. Thus Marx became an icon to be worshipped without anyone knowing anymore, after Engels and Lenin died, what exactly he had said. The practical work of the left consisted in the immense effort to put back on its feet what opportunism had destroyed. If anyone thinks that this has meant a kind of abdication from concrete tasks, they should first look at the political battle fought by the left over 60 years and then compare it with what both Marx, Engels and Lenin did throughout their lives. If we pay attention, the passage already read by Marx does not provide any particular recipes to apply. Instead, he speaks of a dynamic of material change that communists tune into. They therefore do not fight a battle of ideas, but a real battle. In studying the question, the left has produced a text, of all others, that reframes the question precisely from a dynamic point of view, and that is the text Property and Capital. It deals with the maturity of capitalist forms and thereby addresses the question of the transition from an old form to a new form. The attitudes men hold in this transition are consequential. Humanity is not revolutionary because at some point it takes on revolutionary ideas. Humanity, from an ideal point of view, is conservative, i.e. it tends to preserve the old forms, those that made it possible to achieve results that it no longer wants to give up. The quotation on which we will base this first part of the meeting, and which we will read at the end by way of conclusion, is from Marx, from 1846, and is taken from a letter he wrote before being forced to respond to Proudhon's enormous written output. Before writing The Misery of Philosophy, Marx wrote this letter to Annenkov where he explains in a few lines what the fundamental concept of revolution is, a concept that Proudhon had evidently not understood. Since Proudhon represents one of those invariants mentioned earlier, this is rather interesting for us. From the point of view of understanding processes, if we want to deal with the dynamic we have been talking about, we have to see what happened in the history of modes of production, because that is the dynamic we are interested in. History comes before the discovery of its laws by men, that is trivial. Apart from the fact that to discover in history a dynamic based on the periods marked by a certain mode of production already means to know. In a certain sense, it is through the discovery of a fundamental law that one discovers all the other laws that move nature. Marx is 19 years old when he writes to his father that he has made this first discovery. He already defines, we are in 1837, what his path will be and says, I fell ill with philosophy, in the sense that I had to call the doctor and have him send me to the country. After the indigestion I got better. He still uses this somewhat poetic language of youth. I saw the light and realized that all ideal questions, that is, those that concern the heads of men, can be treated according to the methods of the science of nature. I took the gods from heaven and threw them into the center of the earth. From there on, Marx does nothing but develop this concept. In dealing with Proudhon's theses in his letter to Annenkov, Marx continues his fight against the ideas swirling around in men's heads and takes an absolutely concrete attitude, i.e. foreign to a mere opinion poll. They are all stories, he says. Indeed, humanity as a sum of individuals intends to preserve, mind you, a verb preserve, its achievements. But it is precisely in order to conserve its achievements that it is forced to break the old forms that have enabled these achievements. This is the step we consider absolutely fundamental. The practical demonstration of the fact that the power of ideas is not the engine of the world must be made from the point of view of what has happened in history and what may happen tomorrow on the basis of the changes taking place. Those taking place in the material process, not those that the thinking individual would like. Utopia, Science and Action is a chapter in the text Property and Capital, the last one. Closing its inquiry into the historical and irreversible maturing of forms of property, it comes to the defense of the need to observe the process as a whole. It is here that the concept of dynamics overcoming photographic statics is introduced. We have no hesitation in asserting that those who fail to do so exclude themselves from Marxism and even from science in general. As far as we are concerned, the dynamics of capitalist becoming is what we must observe through the results achieved, those that humanity will not want to give up so easily. When is capitalism born? When there is sufficient capital to trigger the production of surplus value through wage labor. What are its first obvious manifestations? The emergence of two distinct and antagonistic classes, capital holders and wage earners. All other manifestations of ownership and exploitation, although historical invariants of class societies, do not fall under capitalism unless they undergo this transformation, the relationship between antagonistic classes through the existence of surplus value. It is from this point that utopia is born. But it is also from this point that utopia, at the same time, begins to transform itself into science by linking itself to reality. Not even utopia is exempt from historical determinations, hence it is never equal to itself, reproducing in its manifestations the actual development of the productive forces. Men, in their tendency towards the preservation of their achievements, do not feel the advent of the capitalist form at all, but that does not mean they do not experience it. That is to say, they fail to give theoretical accommodation to the experience, but they record its results in some form. This form is what was called utopia after the happy island imagined by Thomas More. We therefore begin within the cinematography that will take us up to the present day to define the link between science and revolutionary praxis. Utopia by Thomas More. Thomas More wrote his Utopia in 1516. It is not a fictional book but a denunciation of English society of the time. The narrator speaks of this strange country discovered, not surprisingly, during Amerigo Vespucci's expedition. The discovery of the Americas and the revolutionary whiplash that this entails on the entire society therefore has its effects. In denouncing English society, the narrator says that sheep are eating men, that is, that rising capitalism leads the big agrarians to invest in property and thus to fence off common land. Hence the dispossession and immiseration of peasants, hence vagrancy, hence free labor for capitalist exploitation, hence, finally, Henry VIII's vagrancy laws, forced labor houses, and the first demands of a vast foreign market. Obviously the author cannot give theoretical accommodation to all this, but one thing he does have the narrator say towards the end of the first book: the cause of all evil is the property relationship. So in the second book, a society free of property and money is described. The text is to be enjoyed in both the critical and the utopian parts. They cannot be separated. On the island of Utopia, a kind of communism prevails and, based on what we have just said, every Marxist reader understands well that this kind of society is not the product of a real process but of an ideal aspiration of the author. The real process is not yet even capitalism, which already produces its own critique. So communism does not lie in Utopia, but in the critique of nascent capitalism. Perfect, we are in line with Marx. Communism is not an ideal society but the process that destroys the present one. Capitalism is not yet born that already triggers its own process of destruction. Thomas More criticizes the revolutionary closure of pastures, so he would like to preserve the freedom of common access typical of feudalism. His attempt to preserve a result in the presence of disruptive development leads him to break through the limits of contradiction. His pre-scientific utopia is a hybrid of communism and feudalism. In the Happy Island there are many of the categories present in feudal society with something extra that is due to the overlapping of the critique of capitalism with an ideal conception of society. In the island of Utopia there is no longer property, but there is the family, there is war, there are even slaves, which in 16th century England had long since disappeared, while their market was still flourishing in other areas by the Venetians and Portuguese. In short, everything that the author could see in the society of his time is reproduced in Utopia, minus the evils that flowed from it all. In our eyes, therefore, it is not communism that appears, but the society of the 16th century whose defects are removed in an entirely mental operation. There is no overcoming of form, everything is limited to an operation of ideal creation of a model. But it remains detached from the real historical process. We are careful not to criticize Thomas More for this, even if the greatness of his construction is consistent with his conflict with the king. He did not understand the explosive needs of the emerging social form, entered into political contradiction with it and was beheaded by the king, while the old form made him a saint of the church. We cannot claim from Thomas More a theoretical accommodation of his communist model. He could not go as far as a radical critique of a society that was only then coming into being and therefore had not yet expressed its full potential. An epoch could not be skipped, the bourgeois revolution was still 2.5 centuries away. Only when one glimpses the potential of the next form can one pass judgment on the one in which one lives. Therefore, even the value of the ideal model can only be thoroughly investigated a posteriori. Marx insists on this point. To actually understand the reality of a certain type of social form, it is not enough to start from that reality, one must go to the higher form. But this cannot be done if the higher form does not already produce visible material manifestations. For Marx, communism already produced visible manifestations in its time. Our field of investigation should therefore be more mature than it was then, our task made easier. Communism is, for example, the socialization of production. In the capitalism of Marx's time this was visible. Lenin called it transitional capitalism. We have to say something about that, if another 70 years and more have passed since Lenin. Thomas More could not have been the forerunner of communism, as many like to imagine, but the forerunner of capitalism through criticizing its early misdeeds. The greatness of Utopia does not consist in its semblance of communism, but in its defense of the achievements of a dying society, to maintain which one could only break the mold that held back the further impetus of the productive forces. We read an example of this in a direct description. If the population grows more than normal throughout the island, then citizens of all ages are chosen to send them to form a colony governed by the same laws on the nearest continent, wherever the natives have land in superabundance and do not cultivate it. They make their laws and techniques available for the benefit of all. Instead, they drive back beyond the boundaries they assign to themselves, those who do not agree to live according to their laws, and if they resist, they make war on them. They consider it a just cause for war that a people should possess land and not make use of it, but rather leave it barren and unused without allowing others to use and possess it who, by right of nature, could make a living from it. This is a grandiose conception for feudal Europe of the time. The Great Elizabeth had not yet been born, the English fleet did not yet dominate the seas, English colonialism would come after a couple of centuries. This is the true anticipation of Thomas More, because he is able to identify in feudal society all the nascent categories that will be characteristic of future capitalism. He develops them and transports them to a world without the constraints of the old society. Property exists, but it is impersonal. The family is there, but its place in the scale of social values is demoted. War is waged, but no longer in favor of dynasties, but to safeguard a mode of production deemed perfect, although prisoners are still made slaves, the diehards are put at the service of the community. Finally, those who waste God's gift, the earth, are forced to accept certain laws because the waste of a good that must be common, of all humanity, is not permitted. And this is a true anticipation of bourgeois colonial justification. Those who reach those heights of civilization have the sacrosanct right to impose their law on those who waste nature's resources. Speaking of civilization, let us read another passage. Not only do the capitalist categories exist in utopia, but when the author imagines something truly new and important there, he idealizes a beautiful hospital where the sick can be happily treated. The greatest attention is paid to the sick who are treated in public hospitals. They have 4 per town, a little outside the walls, so large that they can be compared to small towns in their turn. First, so that however great the number of the sick may be, there will always be plenty of room for everyone, and secondly, so that those with contagious diseases may be isolated from others. It is clear to us that a true revolution consists in eliminating disease and not in curing masses of people who fall ill. Now, one of the economic indices of civilization produced by bourgeois bulletins is the number of beds. While we can excuse Thomas More imagining for his era small, bright and healthy cities for the sick, we cannot admit the same parameter for our future society. In the most civilized country in the world, the United States, there is the largest number of beds in relation to inhabitants. For us, this is an index of social decadence, of disease subservient to profit. How on earth could the immense chemical pharmaceutical medical apparatus make money if there were no sick people, and certainly not of social advancement? In the future society there will be few sick people and therefore few hospital places. In the early 1500s capitalism could be anticipated because it was present and operating, communism could not. Thomas More is on the edge of the historical party because he gave his all. Others will come along who will fall short and Marx will treat them as adversaries. But let us not anticipate. All this is very interesting, but it does not yet take us to the terrain useful for understanding the path from utopia to the science of communism. It takes at least 2 utopias for us to see the difference, and it takes several utopias over time to distinguish any one dynamic. Tommaso Campanella and the basics of ownership. If all utopias were equal, the argument we are making would fall apart. Let us leave England, then, and come to Italy. At first glance, despite almost a century having passed, there is not much difference between Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun and Moro's Utopia. Campanella too projects into his ideal society all the categories present in the one he lives in, eliminating its defects. But unlike Moro, he links the existence of property to the existence of a very precise material factor. We are in 1602 in Italy, a country quite different from England. The latter is more advanced as a power. In the space of a few years it will become a world maritime power and will thus be able to bring about a development of capitalism as a system, in the sense that maritime trade will actually represent a push towards a real, concrete future, a development for other countries as well. Italy is the one that loses this advantage with the discovery of the Americas, and this affects its national setup, but at that time Naples is much larger than London and more tonnage still passes through its port. However, since Italy is a transit area for all races and all powers with their armies, it is also an incubation zone for all social experiments. This is where the Renaissance and Machiavelli were born, this is where capitalism was born, this is where it first reached its fascist phase, this is where communism had its very precise punctuation between the degeneration of the Second International, the birth of the Third, and the degeneration of the latter as well. We take the liberty of thinking that Tommaso Campanella, a contemporary of Galileo, he writes an apologia for him, does not by chance express a different utopia from that of Thomas More. What is the fundamental basis on which life in the City of the Sun is set? Whereas in Moro the family is still the nucleus of society, with the power of the husband over the wife and of both over the children, in Campanella this disappears. The family simply does not exist and the children belong to the whole of society. It is already an indication of good materialism to say that the origin of all the troubles of civilization lies in the fact that the family is the support of private property. We are already beyond the mere representation of a generalized reality. This is not communism either, but there is already the identification of a point that is fundamental for us, the same point that Engels would develop in quite another context. But let us read. All property arises from making one's own home and one's own children and one's own wife, whence arises self-love, egoism, for in order to sublimate one's son to riches or dignity or to leave him an heir, each one becomes a public rapacious person if he has no fear of being powerful, or miserly, insidious and hypocritical if he is powerless. When self-love is lost, the commune alone remains. Whereas in the rustic London of the 16th century, Moro was concerned about sheep-eating men, in the overcrowded, urban Naples of the 17th century, Campanella is concerned about men eating men. His communist society derives from the elimination, first of all, of the causes that generate misery in a developed urban environment, where the king and the bank rule, where industry produces wealth but does not distribute it, where the crumbs of this wealth break the ecological balance of the population, which ends up growing disproportionately in a miserable condition. This is why one can already think of the elimination of the family and private property. It is obvious that, like Morrow, Campanella could not yet address the economic, material nexus, the law operating behind the production-wealth-population relationship. Even in early 17th century Italy, capitalism had not yet developed to the point where a theory of its critique was possible, i.e. it could not yet project men towards a higher system so that from that higher vantage point they could judge what was going on. But the fact that Campanella records the family ownership nexus is remarkable. We are not simply faced with the elimination of an undesirable social defect, but with the identification of its causes and the description of the only consequence that can result from it. Certainly no communist today would think that the family is the cause of private property. But this is because today capitalism is so mature that the potential presence of the new form allows the question to be reversed. It is not private property that exists because of the existence of the family, but it is the family that survives because private property exists. We no longer need to eliminate the family in order to eliminate private property, Campanella does. For us, the family, without property, will become extinct, like the state, like the last class in history. Campanella was still forced to create an ideal model in which to eliminate a real obstacle. For the rest, he still maintains, like Morrow, that the inhabitants of his communist city wage war to oust the rebellious enemy of reason, who does not deserve to be a man. And they subjugate him, i.e. they put his possessions in common and impose their orders on him, hurrying in a single day to demolish his defenses and kill his leaders, so that no time is wasted and they begin to devote themselves to his good. This means integrating the former enemy, exploiting the land in every corner, centrally planning production, which of course still resembles the arts and crafts system, according to everyone's needs. In the Solari system, there is still currency, though only for external exchange, and there are still slaves. Francis Bacon and social productivity. In the meantime, history goes on while we are still operating the camera. Let's go back to England. If you want, the precise date is 1624, but the time is that of the maritime explosion, which also occurred with the help of the great institutional privateers Drake and Raleigh. The Renaissance moves to the island. The Enlightenment is not yet on the horizon, but scientific thought influences philosophy and production. In this situation, another utopian, Francis Bacon, writes another utopia. Well, actually Bacon was not exactly a utopian like the other characters mentioned. Marx says of him, "The true progenitor of English materialism and of all modern experimental science is Bacon. The science of nature constitutes for him the true science, and sensitive physics, the main part of the science of nature. In Bacon, as its first creator, materialism contains within itself, in a still naive way, the germs of an omnilateral development. Matter, in its poetically sensitive splendor, smiles upon the whole man." While Galileo at that time was isolated by the Counter-Reformation, Bacon was free to circulate his results, and his work was therefore known throughout Europe. In the New Atlantis, this is the title of Bacon's Utopia, we find ourselves, as always, faced with projections of known societies whose flaws and contradictions are eliminated. There is no real leap in quality, because we are always in the presence of aspects of the fantastic communism typical of ideal models. From this point of view, the main characteristics of Utopia, the City of the Sun and Bacon's New Atlantis are practically the same, but there is a dozen pages that from our point of view represent a formidable event. It is a catalogue of the scientific achievement of that civilization. At a certain point the traveller is taken to a structure that from our point of view, that is, for us who have already achieved certain results through Marxism, is certainly the party of that society. It is the House of Solomon, where the scientists who hold knowledge are gathered. Knowledge of sorts, never esoteric, the domain of the few, secret or the subject of wonder. Because the law of the New Atlantis dictates that science must be divulged, and those who treat scientific fact, even the most astounding, as a phenomenon of magic or a freak show must be punished. Because there must be no wonder in a phenomenon of nature, it is something that must be studied and used for the good of all. There is a break here not only with the practice of the time, but also with current practice. The main purpose of the scientific institution of Atlantis, of this social structure of sorts, is to disseminate knowledge as widely as possible in all fields, to free it from the constraints of the individual. Those who make it the subject of specific heritage are prosecuted. Very nice, but so far nothing really extraordinary. Agreed, it is already a far cry from the previous utopias, where the marvelous and the extraordinary are still used to amaze the reader, but we are faced with a traditional family, property, money. There are commodities and merchants, there are wars. The most interesting thing about Bacon's Utopia is that everything revolves around science, and references to social structure are either non-existent or barely hinted at, sometimes indirectly. There is no mention of how the economy is organized, but it is very clear that all the descriptions concerning agriculture, technology, and the exploitation of resources and knowledge lead to a happy environment through lack of need, through abundance due to the enormous social productive force. All the wealth produced by this society is evidently the result of its scientific and centralized organization, where there are even people to coordinate knowledge so that specialization does not cause breakdowns. Ultimately, need is overcome no longer through goodwill or social rules, but through the material power of socialized production. Thus, the Baconian catalogue of knowledge in New Atlantis is the anticipation of the power of science, that is, the prediction of what it could do if it were applied to production and if this production were socialized. This was neither in Campanella nor in More. For the first time in a utopian philosophical text, the science of production is identified as the motor of a society free of need and therefore of particular nagging. This fact induces the author not to worry too much about the aspects that worried the previous utopians, hence the survival of money, commodities, or property is absolutely secondary in the new Atlantis. So much so that social molecules are no longer undifferentiated, but organically inserted in different functions with different characteristics, and participate in the whole with characteristics of harmony, whereby individuality, no longer denied or exalted, but placed at the service of the species, becomes a collective force. Morrow, Campanella and Bacon were not writing or acting to overthrow the society of the time. Rather, their actions were aimed at preserving and improving it. Thomas More was not sentenced to death because he wrote Utopia, but because he rejected schism with the church. Campanella, who is persecuted for an attempted anti-Spanish and anti-clerical revolt, can write The City of the Sun and all his own works precisely because he is in prison. It is significant that none of the great utopians mentioned speak of the future society, but merely imagine a present society in fictional places. It was not yet the time for a conception of change in terms of increasing social force. That is why we cannot take a condescending attitude towards them. Woe betide those who say, nice communism, here there are slaves, there is the currency, there is still the family, and patriarchal to boot. Evidently communism is not to be found in the model, but in the dynamic that produces different models depending on the material basis on which they are built. In such a dynamic, for example, the slave appears because one does not know what to do with the enemy who does not submit to the superior order. The idealistic construction does not foresee social complexity, so much so that it has no nuances, it is always very clear-cut, the enemy is the enemy, either he integrates or he disappears, dead or slave. Campanella, for example, imagines that the inhabitants of the City of the Sun conquer a city, explain their laws, and then, if the conquered are irreducible and do not understand the advantage of the new situation, the city must be destroyed, the leaders must be annihilated, and the inhabitants must be subjected to these laws. Because they will be better off, not because there is a will to conquer. The City of the Sun is self-sufficient in a closed system, it does not need expansion. A mental model does not need a dynamic of struggle to reach its realization. It is enough for all men to agree. But if they do not agree? Just kill them, it is very simple. Or make them slaves, who will then be freed because all inhabitants of the happy society are naturally good and follow the path of righteousness. Charles Fourier and the Anticipation of Possibilities. Now let us take a leap back in history and come to things closer to us. Let's see what happens in utopias, which we can only hardly call them that anymore, that matured in the age of capitalism. Those of the last century are practically those analyzed by Engels in the Anti-Düring. A utopianist like Fourier no longer imagines a city of the sun, an island of utopia, or a new Atlantis contemporary with him. On the contrary, he reveals that contemporary is the level reached by the productive forces and the resulting society of the civilized, while the future envisages liberation from chaos and immediate entry into the epoch of universal harmony. What should enable this transition is the generalized understanding of his theory of the four movements, the social, the animal, the organic and the material. We note in passing that utopia is still present in the order of importance in which these movements are placed. Our camera could never film them in that order, but in reverse. In history, the first frame would film matter and the last, provisional one would be a zoom on society as it is. In any case, Fourier's society can hardly be called a model to be achieved, but a destructive critique of the current civilized society. I was very far from thinking of research into destinies. I shared the general opinion that considers them impenetrable, and that relegates to the visions of astrologers and magicians any reasoning on that subject. The study that initiated me into these researches concerned only industrial or political problems. I applied myself to seeking the good only in matters that had no relation to administration or the priesthood, and that were based only on industrial and domestic measures, compatible with all sorts of government without needing their intervention. At the basis of Fourier's world, with its phalansteries, which were understood as proposals for utopias, and some even tried to realize them, lies a theory that serves as support for the critique of present society. I, who had no party to support, could adopt absolute doubt, and apply it first of all to civilization and its most inveterate prejudices. Fourier creates a system through which he succeeds in making a fierce critique of today's society, from the world of philosophy to that of production, from the relations between people to the institution of the family. In his model, the categories of society no longer exist. We no longer have a society rewritten the same, but with the caveat of avoiding its contradictions. Those who saw in Fourier a suggestion of models to be realized, and, as we have said, some have attempted it, got it all wrong. Even Fourier, before Marx, had shouted so loudly that his followers had gone deaf. In fact, they went on to constitute phalansteries without realizing that their father was first destroyer than builder. Fourier cries out against capitalist society. Oh sure, he still shouts against injustice, prejudice and the commonplace, but he uses such a fierce satire that there is no longer any doubt that we are now at the destruction of chains, no longer at the construction of utopias. Just as Saint-Simon dreamed of gathering the government of the world under the sign of Newton, so Fourier proclaims the total separation of philosophy, which he calls uncertain science, from fixed science. Philosophers are the worst propagators of prejudice even as they strive to fight it, while the science of industry is the solution. Science will be the solution, and every inhabitant of harmony will be able to count on cheap abundance rather than cheap narrowness. Fourier's crazy disquisitions on love, children, gastronomy, and the mode of production have been variously interpreted. Was he crazy? Was he mocking the reader? Or was he criticizing a society whose burden he could no longer bear? Marx appreciated his poetry of satire. Engels went further by fighting against Dühring, who had despised him, and called him a great satirist on the miseries of the much-vaunted civilization. Both, therefore, do not underestimate him at all. If we also do not want to underestimate him, we must agree that Fourier is the first who is concerned with a central plan of production and distribution aimed at guaranteeing quality and differentiation according to the taste of the user. Put another way, he is the first who, in poetic form, describes in detail a plan for the reproduction of species. He is the first who directly refutes the commonplace according to which communism equates to a flattened life among indistinct human molecules. Fourier conveys the joy of production, but above all the joy of the end of that production, namely the satisfaction of human needs. The survival of the buying and selling of products becomes absolutely secondary, as does a certain social graduation within harmony. One only has to read chapters such as The Deceptions of Foiled Melons, or The Prodigies of Serial Composite Gastronomy, or The Harmonic Transactions, or The Triumph of the Leathery Chickens, A Problem of Bicomposite Gastronomy, to realize that the humanity represented by the average Frenchman of the time can do without the regulation soup of onion or cabbage washed down with the equally regulation cheap sour wine of the Midi. It is enough to free oneself from civilization to automatically eliminate degradation and grayness, vacuity and sadness. If there are gradations of income in harmony, they are cancelled out by the end of all activity, the individual and social enjoyment of use values. Exchange values are thereby eliminated. If communism is not in the writer's pen, it emerges forcefully from what he denies. For Fourier, it is not so much a question of changing man as of changing civilization, and his descriptions illustrate a glittering realm of the possible, not an idea. Rid the world of civilization, and you can afford to be fools of abundance and not ascetics of the single plate dear to the ancient Spartans, communists of misery. Robert Owen and the action. Owen started as a labourer in a cotton mill. In his 20s he was manager of a spinning mill in Manchester. In his 30s he co-owned a textile factory in New Lanark and turned it into a model production site. In his 50s he succeeded in passing a law restricting the work of women and children. In his 60s he presided over the founding Congress of the world's first general trade union. Throughout his life he devoted himself to the development of the workers' cooperative movement. To categorize Owen among utopians is certainly a stretch, but it is certain that he was the last to pursue a social model based on ideas and morals. In the United States, he founded a community based on social production and consumption, New Harmony, 1826. The main characteristic of Owen's utopianism was praxis. He first organized men, then drew lessons from them and wanted to give the whole thing a social theory guise. He imagined that something could and should be done to overcome the problems of capitalist society. He tried to bring together real forces that could achieve practical results. He provided evidence, evidently not on his own, but with the help of elements in English society at the time, that capitalist society could be overcome. His defeat was in fact due exclusively to three elements: the immaturity of the situation, the struggle that bourgeois society waged against him, the impossibility of linking the trade union movement to a revolutionary political movement. Owen was always opposed to class confrontation despite being a product of it. What interests us about Owen is that he can no longer construct an exclusively mental model, while his criticism of society does not allow him to remain at the level of satire. The England of his time demanded action, while in Germany theory was in the making and in France politics. Owen understood very well that with the surplus value extorted from the workers, the problems of destitution of the entire population could be overcome. He knows that a planned increase in agricultural and industrial production through the generalized use of machines is possible. He knows that controlled production means abundance, and he knows this because he proved it by running a factory of 2,500 workers and offering their families social welfare for the first time. The liberating potential that Bacon saw in science and social production still to come, for Owen was something that could be touched, already realized. All that was needed was to solve the problem of product distribution and productive anarchy. New Lanark could not have existed if social work had not already been developed. And the foundation of the trade unions was a consequence. From this point of view, the most interesting thing was not the realization of New Lanark and New Harmony, but their failure. The first expressions of the class struggle had shown that the realization of socialist demands could not pass through models. However concrete rather than imaginary they were still models and could not represent islands of a new social order in a capitalist sea, just as proletarian movements were abandoning Luddism and primitive forms to become mass movements, even political ones like Chartism. It was materially inevitable for a consistent character like Owen to move from the failure of the productive and social experience to the class struggle and the founding of the General Union. We are not interested in syndicating Owen's conception of the Union as an element in the gradual transformation of society at this time. What is important is to note how in every revolution the constructive element is defeated and the destructive one takes over. This is how it must be, even if men would like constructive and therefore conservative attitudes better. But how does revolutionary destruction take place that is at the same time construction? Marx and the phenomenal forms of revolution. We, who are always accused of being theorists, contradict everyone, and this time we want to be practical. Engels, who was a practical man, exhorted, stop making idle enunciations and proclamations. When you launch a watchword you must say, immediately afterwards, how the hell you want to realize it, with what instruments and with whom. To make a revolution, as they say, you need forces. Who does it? Marx was still small when Owen tried his experiments and had not yet theoretically settled the fact that, through a real movement, the revolution is made by one particular class against another. Our problem this morning in relation to the Utopia Science Action trinomial is, but how does this class make the revolution? Recall that for Marx, the proletariat initially manifests its revolutionary potential by attempting to preserve the existing. Generalizing the terms of the question, humanity tends to conserve the conquests it has achieved. And it is only in attempting to conserve these achievements that it realizes it must break certain forms within which they apply and operate. The working class has always behaved exactly like this, without knowing it, without anyone theorizing it, long before Marx gave a materialist explanation in 1847 against Proudhon. The workers who first saw their jobs threatened by machines first smashed the machines themselves, regardless of whether or not they were a representation of the revolutionary development of the productive forces. Thus the English miners a few years ago, faced with the closure of the world's worst pits, fought to keep them open without thinking that the same revolutionary development of the productive forces had decreed their closure. So let us return to Engels. If we were to say, defense of the workplace, how would we be placed? How would we demonstrate how it is done? Do we smash the machines that produce too much? Or do we occupy the factories that close down? In the first case, we would return to the late 1700s, in the second we would screw ourselves. But let us move on to answer the practical question of what to do at certain junctures. We have traveled the road of utopia, we have seen that this too was conditioned by the dynamics of the development of the productive forces, and now we must move on to science, i.e. the understanding of phenomena and the concrete solution to problems. We said concrete solution, make our critics happy. Of course we could do great things if there was a trade union life of the proletariat, if there was its political organization. Instead, humanity defends the conquests it has achieved, as a true reactionary, despite our revolutionary proclamations. And the proletarians are not to be outdone, they even fight to be able to keep their jobs at lower conditions than those achieved. Let us not even mention the bourgeoisie. There is no leftist who has avoided lamenting the rightward swerve of Western governments, who has not cried about the attack on the working class, the elimination of the welfare state, the privatization of the economy, etc. Yet in no Western country has there been any substantial change in this respect. And moreover, the general tendency is to send left-wing parties to deal with the crisis caused by the globalization of the economy. It is at this point that our traditional critic, who is also a traditional activist, no longer understands anything and despairs, he feels betrayed of his expectations. Hadn't he read that the working class is the revolutionary class? And where is he? That the bourgeois are right about the death of communism? In the face of this we cannot vague forms of struggle that are not there. We can't make a Luddite critique of the robot, nor can we shut ourselves up like rats in a trap inside closed mines or failed factories to defend a job that's gone. The comrade said earlier that our work has twofold aspects. We are closed with regard to fundamental issues and at the same time open in discussion with those who approach us. We have no party founding ambitions, but try to work in a party method. We see things from the most general point of view possible, but we need to identify the particular problem. We are abstract, schematic, dogmatic and even sectarian, as the title of one of our letters puts it, but we have no intention of hovering in the stratosphere and losing touch with earthly reality. The fact is that abstraction and the ability to schematize is linked to the possibility of solving practical problems. If Marx at 19 had identified the problem by basing his analysis of social phenomena on the methods used by the science of physical nature, it is clear that we cannot go back and base our action on subjective interpretations of reality as everyone does. If we talk about revolution, about social movements, we must adopt the same processes of abstraction as those adopted by mathematics, physics, information science. But one cannot accuse those who adopt these methods of abstractionism or schematism when they are adopted because practical problems cannot be solved otherwise. Lenin, who was far more practical than all the Leninist practitioners, was a master of abstraction. At the station in Finland, holding flowers offered to him by the provisional government, he jumps into the armored car and salutes the vanguard of the world revolution. Those present take him for a fool. But the proletarian revolution in Russia could not have been made if the subject had been handled from the point of view of Russian affairs. It is not the purpose of this meeting to demolish all the things that have been said against our current and against us. But if we are here to talk about revolution, if we are to make sense of our future existence, if we are convinced that we are going down a road that has already been mapped out, we must certainly do a didactic work, because the extent of the destruction that has occurred even within our own ranks is great, as anyone who is not insane can see. Of course, also with regard to ourselves. It is the revolution that teaches us, poor that fool who imagines he is teaching the revolution. It is normal that, being involved in so many things, we sometimes fail to keep the thread going, because the forces are certainly not those of a developed party. The important thing is to keep an eye on the compass, to base ourselves on those points that our history has already identified as fundamental, the only ones that guarantee solutions. Let us end for now with an extension of that one quote from Marx on which we have built a little history of the revolutionary process. We summarized it first, now let us read it in full. Proudhon confuses ideas with things. Men never renounce what they have conquered, but this does not mean that they never renounce the social form in which they have acquired certain productive forces. Quite the contrary. In order not to be deprived of what they have gained, men are forced to change all their traditional social forms as soon as the mode of their trade, of production and reproduction, no longer corresponds to the productive forces they have acquired. The long transition from utopia to science shows that even the utopians were not mere ramblers after all. They tended to preserve the best things in history by projecting them into abstract systems drawn on paper. But they could not preserve the best without destroying traditional social forms that no longer corresponded to the development of the productive forces. The utopians were therefore chain destroyers. Marx begins his critique of political economy by showing that destroying chains is exactly what needs to be done to free the productive forces. He concludes the manifesto of the Communist Party with the same concept of liberation applied to the working class, proletarians: you have only your chains to lose. Before that, he had said that even philosophy could not be realized without destroying itself. His concept of philosophy is well known. It had the task of interpreting the world. It is now a matter of changing it, so philosophy too is a chain that must be destroyed. We have set ourselves a task that is both modest and great at the same time, that of preserving a great theoretical heritage and practical teaching. We have realized that, in order to do this, we too in our small way are forced to destroy chains, suffocating shells in which this heritage has been enclosed. Part 2. Action. Proudhunism resurgent and tenacious. The quoted phrase is used by Marx against Proudhon. The latter presents himself as a revolutionary and is convinced that he is the spokesman for a concrete policy to solve concrete problems. He therefore invents a political and economic system that everyone should adopt because, according to him, it is so universal that it can withstand any test. Marx, as soon as he analyzes Proudhon's work, immediately ranks him further behind Owen, Fourier, and the utopians. Because, once the human sciences have arrived at new methods to clarify certain processes, it no longer makes sense to return to earlier methods. In this, Proudhon is a remnant of the past, in the sense that he certainly does not work to preserve in order to destroy present forms. He does not want to break the limits, the chains of the present in order to project himself into the future. He does conservation work in order to preserve what is there. Insofar as he wants a future, he thereby freezes the camera, making it a mere witness to the past. Indeed, the past is in the film, the camera is no longer needed. The dialectic implicit in Marx's concept is not, after all, an incomprehensible abstruseness. Let us take an example. Yesterday, we were in the square, on the sidelines of an anti-fascist demonstration. Obviously it was completely unfamiliar to us, yet we were glad to have seen and heard it, because you can never learn enough. Today, anti-fascism is a bit disoriented, being in government and having to apply fascist policies, but who cares? In the end it turned out to be a demonstration with a few thousand people. Clearly molecular movements persist, preventing the thermal death of society. At least as far as young people were concerned, the 25th of April seemed to be a pretext, but the events in Peru had provided a democratic lowest common denominator. In one corner, Rifondasion's official commemorators were holding rallies, a fine example of conservation for conservation's sake, yet another confirmation of the ultra-reaction of certain elements who still dare to refer to communism. Marx's observation has a practical disruptive power, the facts from which it springs are as diffuse as the air we breathe. The speaker, in this case a speaker, after having made his fine whimper about the regulation partisan gravestone smeared with the regulation fascist paint, issued a cry of pain at the fall of moral values in this materialist society, values now monopolized by the Catholic Church with a consequent vacuum on the left, a vacuum that had to be filled. Just as the Catholics were successful in appropriating those values, so the left had to pick up the banner of solidarity, of the social state in the process of destruction. We were reminded of Togliatti, but we were even on a lower rung. In fact, the good Palmiro had merely argued that the resistance represented the new Risorgimento for Italy, whose flag had been dropped in the mud by the bourgeoisie, and the PCI's task was to pick up the tricolour from the mud and bring it back to popular honours. We thought it was the ultimate, but here in Rome, in 1997, we verified that for opportunism the bottom does not exist. On its downward precipice it never reaches it. And so we heard emotional shouts, we must be the proponents of a new secular religion. Applause. It will be a small example. It will be an individual gaffe. But how can we not think that there is instead consistency? Togliatti had paved the way, and before him Stalin with the Great Patriotic War. And before that those who condemned the left in the name of socialism in one country. There is no limit to degringolade, as Amadeo called it. But think of it, religion. Catholic or secular, it doesn't matter, this is the concept that settles in the minds of those who begin to think communism is a mission. Fortunately, the individual preserves in order to preserve, but humanity as a whole must destroy in order to preserve its achievements and go further. Now, in the second part of this report we will see, starting precisely with the attitude of the working class, that this dialectic of conserve to destroy actually works. And it can also help us understand what action is for communists, i.e. what they must do. Some will recall that we criticized in one of our letters the mania of asking the question, what to do? And then giving an answer that everyone, or each group, works out in their own way. One echoes Lenin, we said, but one interprets him badly. Lenin knew very well what to do. It was the immediatists of the time who did not know. Every communist, based on the experience of a century and a half of organized class struggle, of the communist movement, of that dynamic subjected to our camera, should know what to do and tell those who do not yet know. However, since the degringolade has been there, and it is not over, it is inevitable that we will go into these things. Proudhon and Taucourt conservation. How is one consistently revolutionary in a conservative world? How does one feel the shift from conservation to trying to maintain achievements that cannot be maintained without destroying the old social form? In order not to be wishful thinkers who exchange their desires for reality, we must start with the things that the world makes available to us, however much they make us turn up our noses. And so we put together the quote from earlier with the one from the manifesto read by the companion during the presentation, where Marx says that communists are not based on the ideas of some world renewer, but on the general manifestations of actual class relations, those existing today and not tomorrow, those of the historical movement unfolding before our eyes, as it is. Here then we armor ourselves against the forces that drag us towards idealistic ground and set ourselves on a soil on which it is difficult for the plant of new secular religions to grow. We took concepts from a text of the left, Property and Capital, and linked them to a text by Engels, Socialism from Utopia to Science. Then we made a further connection with Marx, who shows that utopia dies as pre-science but survives as opportunism. With Proudhon we actually have the true exponent and representative of conservation disguised as a revolutionary. Henceforth opportunism represents the ideology of the ruling class infiltrated, as a material factor acting through men and organizations, within the proletarian ranks. As a result of this phenomenon, the revolutionary movement will be defeated not so much by the weapons of the adversary as by the presence of the latter's ideology within the proletarian organizations. Marx shows that Proudhon no longer has any excuse to invent ideal models. Given the development of the productive forces, given the results achieved, it is no longer permissible for those who believe themselves to be in the ranks of the revolution to fabricate hybrids between the old form and the new. Proudhon knows that there has been a succession of social forms, and he writes this. He is aware that there has been progress in the productive forces, and he writes this. He also knows that men are not an indistinct mass, at most divided between those who have power and those who do not, between rich and poor or the like. He knows that humanity is divided according to antagonistic classes, and he also records this in his writings. He even knows that men have not been conscious of their material becoming, and that it is material forces that move them rather than ideas, and he also writes this. But in the end he appeals to universal consciousness to change society. For Proudhon, men must want to the new society and reject the old. As he is the hybrid product of an epoch of transition from utopia to science, his socialism has a veneer of materialism, and Marx can only demolish this veneer to expose the true petit bourgeois substance. For us, the conclusion is that since all this is already well known, studied, dissected in 1,000 anatomies from Marx onwards, it is no longer permitted for today's militant to appeal to universal consciousness, innate ideas, justice, or categories of law. If a militant who calls himself a revolutionary registers once and for all that social movements occur through material drives and on the basis of the development of the productive forces, he can no longer think that his own action is aimed at the realization of ideas. This is the fundamental critique contained in Marx's The Misery of Philosophy versus Proudhon. Today's militant can no longer turn back without falling into opportunism. We warmly invite comrades to study Marx's letter to Anenkov on Proudhon. Don't be surprised by our insistence, but the manifesto is based on this original construction and Marx's entire critique of capitalism is based on this fact, as the passage we will read from the Grundrisse in a moment shows, and which holds up this second part of the report. All of Marx's work tends to show that it is the real movement we are interested in, not a model to be achieved. But go and ask what communism actually is to 1,000 militants who call themselves communists, if you can find them, and see how many will give you some updated version of the story of Moses and the Promised Land. From what we have said so far, it takes little to understand that we advocate the need to base all our work of so-called analysis of the situation on the real movement understood as the work of communism today and not as the agitation of groups, parties, and blocs. Action, as we shall see, can only be consequential. All those who have participated in the activity of struggle in demonstrations of strength or weakness of the proletarian movement know that this is the eternal question on which the immediatists slaughter each other, the infamous analysis of the concrete situation from which action should derive. It is no coincidence that Bourdieu, who knew well the material roots of the left's critique, entitled the chapter we mentioned earlier Utopia, Science and Action. 3 elements placed in sequence as if separated by time, but dialectically intertwined. Utopia was the product of reality and at the same time an expedient for ideally eliminating its defects. Science overcame utopia by integrating it, since it too is the product of reality. Having reached a certain historical phase, utopia and philosophy become confused and must be overcome by science. But both utopia and philosophy, and to a certain extent also religion, are science in times past. Nothing is resolved by a juxtaposition, by clear-cut separations between these epochs of human society. Our conception of the world eschews the breaking up of reality when it comes to observing it in its becoming. Even today, since according to Marx, we have not passed the prehistory of mankind, religion, philosophy, the science of nature and the social sciences are separated to the same extent that they are mixed together. Certainly we pollute the science of nature with mysticism, more than we overcome mysticism with the science of nature. On the other hand, we can resort to arbitrary separations when necessary, as long as we know exactly what we are doing. Science could not arrive at more and more certain results if it were unable to construct abstract models, thus isolated from the complexity in which the phenomena under investigation occur. All this is to say that there is no way to make the formula work. Theory is a guide to action. Or the other, action precedes theory. The eternal debates on the relationship theory action program tactics are for the most part hot air, a sterile search for the priority of the chicken or the egg. Think of physics. No physicist today would waste time debating the tactics of the production process. The bourgeois world has overtaken philosophy where it served its praxis. With science, the bourgeoisie changed the world, built machines, and incorporated them into the production and reproduction process of the species. Science served to know the physical world, but also to produce objects, systems of objects, and organized information. Science is thus an element of production, just as language, which served to give science a structure of communication, is an element of production. Within this integrated system of knowledge, the bourgeoisie no longer argues about what the appropriate tactic might be, it uses the results it has achieved and refines them. If with Marx we say that within socialized production there is a flow of objects and information that does not need to be based on value categories, this result is already something we no longer question either. We are thus in the presence of a realized theory-practice unity, perfectly compatible with communism understood as a process and not as a model. Lenin against amateurism. If communists today had the chance to join a generalized school of thought and action, i.e. the Revolutionary Party, they would not be arguing about the theory-practice relationship, they would simply be working towards future results. This is why we insist so much on the fact that it is not the debate that moves us forward, but the common work on precise themes carried out on the basis of a recognized heritage. Action is the result of the physical and practical application of the results achieved. These results must first be defended, and this is perhaps 90% of our work today, but we have seen that Marx teaches us to go further. It is in the defense of these results that we discover the way to go beyond what has been achieved. It is the work that brings new results, not the chatter nor the wandering around looking for what to do. Chit-chat only needs two cogitating individuals and two tongues in motion, whereas work needs a structure of several men coordinating and organic communication. Take Lenin, study his conception of the party, see how he understands its structure, analyze what the work site is for him with the newspaper as the main instrument of communication in every sense, and you will have an idea of what can be learned from communism as a real movement. You don't even need to read between the lines, because Lenin is explicit: learn from the factory and produce professional revolutionaries. The revolutionary Lenin speaks of is certainly not a salaried official who learns only despotic corporatism and suffocating bureaucracy from the factory. He is a comrade who works to achieve future results on the basis of past ones. If there is not yet a generalized working structure, a school, a current, he does not think of going directly to move the masses who, are not even aware of his presence. The first thing the coherent revolutionary asks himself is why we are in this situation, why the counter-revolutionary beating persists, whether by chance there are not profound material reasons, and whether by chance there have not also been political errors. Here then, a study, for example, of the distribution of surplus value in society and past political errors is no longer an academic exercise or premise for debate, but work like that of the engineer preparing to build a bridge. The study of errors is at the same time the study of antidotes to them. Of course, social facts are so much more complicated than building a bridge that the example would need a bunch of additions. For example, revolutions and parties are not built but directed. For example, the time factor is not known, i.e. you do not know when you can raise the rebar and pour the concrete. Nevertheless, Amadeo uses this concept to describe the tasks of the party in the revolution. The party is designed by the tasks it will have to perform in the future. A party of lawyers in the sentence is a non-party, the future needs a party of engineers. This is not in contradiction with the everyday actions of men, who do not make the revolution in order to conquer their paradise or their promised land on the instructions of some Bible or gospel, but, immersed in their problems, in the exchange of their products, in production and in the attempt to live better or defend what is endangered in millions of more or less individual microcosms, participate in that real moment as it destroys the present state of affairs, Marx calls communism. No one individually thinks of making a revolution in defending the general achievements of humanity. Yet it is precisely the mundane everyday life that contains the germs of the social polarization envisaged by Marx that will lead to the destruction of the old constraints on the power of social production. All this can only be understood if we manage not to separate the elements that make up the theory-praxis pair. There is no immanent theory, separate from everyday praxis, that anyone can apply. There is a praxis of men for their reproduction, from which a theory arises, which evidently has a reflection on the praxis of the future. When will people ever realize that in a cinematography the present is a moving point? It is in the dynamic towards the future that we must see the usefulness and suitability of our work. Why do we insist so much on the dynamic? It is simple: the theory of the present, a passing point, is pure existentialism, it is indifference to results. Seize the fleeting moment and you will be catapulted into the circle of opportunists, because the definition of opportunism is just that, sacrificing possible future results to the success of one day. But why does everyone claim to be a Leninist and learn nothing from Lenin? The comrade mentioned earlier our fundamental concept that parties and revolutions are not made, but directed. This means that the same process that leads to revolution also leads to the formation and development of the party that will lead the revolution. It is only through this process that the decisive phenomenon that has been called the reversal of praxis takes place, so well understood by bourgeois scholars of catastrophic processes in nature and utterly undigested by most militants of the various more or less communist groups and parties. As we can see, it is not a question of making yet another analysis of the situation in order to draw practical conclusions from it, at least not in the current sense of the term. Instead, it is a matter, in line with all the work set out by Marx, of overcoming the philosophical, advocacy, or missionary conception of the world. It is neither a question of interpreting it, nor of haranguing it, nor of moralizing it in order to convert it. Once we understand how the world is changing on the basis of the development of the productive forces in which we are immersed, it is a matter of giving comrades, those who are driven to action by the revolution, the appropriate tools to face the future. And since tools cannot be invented, but those that the world makes available are used, evidently the manner of their use cannot be chosen, but is determined. Theory is not enough. The library containing it is overloaded. Humanity has produced thousands of volumes on the preparation of its revolutions, their course, and the balances that followed. A compass is needed so that the militant does not get lost. But the compass does not offer a tabulation of books to read and those to put on the index. This is a Catholic Inquisition method. Right after comes the burning of books, followed closely by the burning of men. Since we are past the burning of books, we must agree that the compass can only be practical work in an organically functioning collective structure. Even the search for a common thread in books is practical work that enables us to make useful connections for action. But this has nothing to do with the application of recipes. Almost nothing is applicable here, today, of what Lenin wrote about the Russian Revolution. Yet we can read Lenin with the utmost confidence, if we can understand that time passes, that history advances, that the camera rolls. But then we can also read the Bible or medieval mysticism. We will not find recipes, but we will refine our compass. We can also not read at all, as long as we are immersed in organically distributed work, which therefore allows for the existence of an environment incompatible with the categories of bourgeois thought and praxis. In this environment, practical work will take place, the effects of which will also affect the surrounding world. This is the Marxist concept of praxis, and nothing else Lenin demanded for his workshop in which the practitioners of revolution worked. That is why he resented the amateurs, the improvisers, the chatterers. Marx and practice in the revolutionary process. We investigate what it means to change things, especially when we have a compass to show us in which direction we should move in order to really change them. In short, we are not interested, from a materialist and scientific point of view, in all those actions that have no consequences for the reality in which we are immersed. If, as Marx says, communism is not a model but an ongoing process, there is no point in being communist only in terms of the end. If we say that the instruments appropriate to the end and the roads to get there are determined, we deny at the same time the freedom of choice on both the instruments and the roads. So the infamous analysis of the situation must consist of identifying what exists in the world as it is, not the world as we would like it to be. If communism is a becoming, it includes ourselves. When one speaks of a process, one is always talking about something that leads to some result. No one is given to being outside this process, even if within it one is given to being out of one's mind and imagining to move masses with proclamations written in a small newspaper that for cats locked in a room read. The most common criticism leveled at the left is that of being outside things, the exact opposite of what the left has always done. Precisely because it was able to be inside things, the left has always been able to hold consistent attitudes. Bordega, according to his critics, would have been a brilliant scientist of revolution, but when it came to putting theory into practice, he would have been wrong. Now, this way of setting up an argument is truly ridiculous from a materialist point of view. Not even for a god of contradiction is there a possibility of being on the right track in theory and then being wrong in practice. Only those who imagine that theory is something different from practice can make such an argument. It is truly a way of proceeding that is far below that of the utopians who had the ability to intelligently represent the processes that were before their eyes. It is just not possible to tune in on this wavelength. If we want proof that the critics of the left are mistaken, we find it in the fact that they make that separation between theory and praxis that they attribute to others. By putting theory before praxis and imagining the latter as an application of theory, they operate a kind of biblical creation. In the beginning was theory, and on the first day the world was created. The superiority of our camera over the camera is not only in its ability to film 360 degrees horizontally and vertically. Our instrument is capable of filming in 4 dimensions because it films in time. And the time of revolutions tells us that we cannot accept divine Big Bang theories. Marx continually uses time lags and continuously moves from the past to the future, from observations on ancient economics, to the critique of vulgar economics, to what could be in a society without an economy, in which there is only production and distribution in physical quantities for the satisfaction of human needs. We will never be able to understand what needs to be done at a given moment simply by analyzing the immediate situation, i.e. by flashing on the fleeting moment. Analysis is a big word. It involves investigating what has happened before, how things have unfolded in history, how problems were solved in the past, or how they were not solved and why. What is the goal to be achieved? On the basis of all this, one determines which is the road to take, which is then the one already mapped out by the material dynamics of the phenomena, with all the signposts in place, already installed by those who came before us. The difficulty lies in cleaning up the signposts, because the dominant ideology, or, if you like, resurgent and tenacious Proudhanism, has sown there a heap of traps, of false signals. Only the aforementioned compass can point you in the right direction, while at the same time functioning as a detector to spot the fakes and get them out of the way so that you can travel safely. As you can see, it would be quite a presumption if we wanted to do all this ourselves. Fortunately, we have a lot of work already done, and if we sometimes mention Bodega a little too much, we will be excused. After all, we are merely using a mnemonic reference for very concrete work, as we do with Marx and Lenin. This brings us to the second quotation from Marx on which we are basing this part of the meeting. In the Grundrisse, criticizing a certain conception of markets and financial movements, Marx states that a model of society, here again the link with utopian procedures, that derived solely from human thought and the aspirations of the individual would now be nonsense. But the importance of the passage we shall now read goes beyond a criticism of Proudhanism. Here, consideration is given to the fact that a given social form does not quietly go its own way. There is thus a precise reference to the necessity of the revolution's destructive action. But what kind of destructive action it will be and where it will come from is a matter of theory. This excludes the possibility of making a revolution on the basis of the existence of men, even well-organized and determined men, who want to make it. Within bourgeois society founded on exchange value, relations of traffic and production are generated, which are as many minds to blow it up. A mass of antithetical forms of social unity, whose antithetical character, however, can never be exploded by means of a quiet metamorphosis. On the other hand, if we did not already find hidden in society as it is, the material conditions of production and the traffic relations corresponding to them, appropriate to a classless society, all attempts to blow it up would be quixotic. We would take the liberty of quibbling. If we assume that we want to achieve a certain result without taking into account what the society we live in really is, we would be doing the wrong thing. But the analysis of the situation is not simply about what the bourgeois do or what the proletarians do or even what the communists do, at least not until the revolution is upon us. If there were no elements of the future society within the present society, such as it is, underlined twice, any action to change it would be nothing more than pure Proudhonian wishful thinking, an attempt by ridiculous Don Quixotes to tilt at windmills. For establishing who is really in the clouds. Let us be on our mettle. We have seen the value of ancient utopia up to Owen, who is already forced to act. We have seen moralizing socialism disguised as science, while it is but a caricature of utopia, the serious one. We have seen that communism is a real process and not a social model to be achieved. Now Marx asks us not to be Don Quixotes and leave the windmills behind. What distinguishes the true Marxist from the rest? That he is part of the communist process taking place in capitalist society as it is. He differs from the mass of the proletariat not because he advocates brilliant ideas, but because he anticipates the future unfolding of things that already exist around him, manifesto. The left has also said something about this way of seeing the revolutionary process. For example, it has fought against indifferentism, which has a Manichaean view of the class struggle. The indifferentist says, we are in the epoch of mature capitalism, therefore in the epoch of pure proletarian revolution. And so far so good. But then he adds, economic struggles, national revolts, peasant uprisings, imperialist wars, and hybrid and complex phenomena must be brought back to the proletarian revolution. The Manichaean vision lies in this: on the one hand, evil, oppressor capitalism in continuous aggression against the world working class; on the other hand, good, the proletarian revolution, to which unions, oppressed masses, even wars, which should have no other destiny than to be transformed into proletarian revolution, should bow. All right, Lenin said it. So if it happens, for example, that the Gulf War breaks out, we open an Internationalist a newspaper and read in it, 1. That it's a war between big and small imperialisms, A for oil, B for supremacy in the area, 2. That it's the task of the proletariat to turn it into civil war, 2A, or that it's the task of the oppressed masses to unite and fight against imperialism. Point 1. We also read in the bourgeois newspapers. The other points are proclamations by the classic fly who believes, resting on the horn of the buffalo, that he is leading the whole herd in a stampede. In both cases, Marx's method has been betrayed. By not starting from the material determinations of events, a concretist analysis of the situation has been made without taking into account bourgeois society as it is, i.e. its contradictions based on productive forces that push and a mode of production that shackles them. This has lost sight of the general problem of the production of surplus value, its distribution in the world, the determinations that weigh on the profit rate, the impact on the latter by the oil rent, and so on. A long chain that leads to the root of wars and the actions of men, whether they are aware or not of the existence of a law on the profit rate. If we were to identify this chain as the linear result of a series of cause-effects, we would be mechanists. In this case, the bourgeoisie would also see the same. But this chain is confused into millions of events that would be absolutely incomprehensible if they were not analyzed according to the knowledge of precise laws. Marxism gives us this possibility. To do without it leads to saying any number of things about events, things that arise from individual thinking. To give practical, concrete examples, even a movement of oppressed non-proletarian masses of the backward world, or a Western movement of classes that have nothing proletarian about them and even represent some remnant of barbarism within this society can represent, says the left, one of the bullets of the revolution that must overwhelm it. We have had before our eyes good demonstrations of what results from the accumulation of events around the determinations of the law of value, the collapse of the East, the so-called bread riots following the measures suggested by the International Monetary Fund, the strikes in Korea. Each event has very specific immediate causes, but the concatenation we make on the basis of Marx's laws shows us that the immediate cause may not be the fundamental one, let alone the explanations the protagonists give for their own actions. This is what our non-indifferentism must be rooted in when faced with the infamous analysis of concrete situations. We are not interested in whether it is peasants, or proletarians, or other forces within this society such as the petty bourgeoisie that trigger events. It does not matter what sporadic form the criticism of the present state of affairs takes, because the overall movement is communism, and any radical criticism that arises from the contradictions of capitalism is objectively against it, even if it were to force it into fascist-type restructurings, as Marx points out in 18 Brumaire. Otherwise one would not understand the meaning of another important statement of the left: one cannot speak of revolution without speaking of counter-revolution and vice versa. The two terms are dialectical elements of the same problem, they are complementary. Everyone agrees that we are in a counter-revolutionary period. Counter-revolution against what? Why does the bourgeoisie have the need to reiterate its 18 Brumaire, to strengthen its executive, to reinforce certain mechanisms of its society? On the one hand, because with the development of the productive forces, the control of economic factors must be intensified. On the other hand, because, as we will try to demonstrate with this afternoon's report, the control of economic factors cannot be separated from the control of an ever-increasing proportion of the population that is no longer needed in productive activities. As the bourgeoisie themselves are observing, the enormous amount of surplus value produced needs to be distributed in a society of non-producers. The trouble for them is that this provokes social reactions primarily among the capitalists and the middle classes. This means that in the end they will not be able to distribute the surplus value as it would benefit them to do, and then this will provoke reactions in the part of society that Marx calls relative overpopulation. For not absorbing the doctrines and will of others. Counter-revolution, after all, is revolution. At this point in capitalist development, if the maturity of the productive forces is communism on the march, as Marx puts it, and if the manifestations of this maturity are visible as the armoring of bourgeois interventionism in the economy, control of the mass of the population, especially the proletariat, then the two terms are identified. The bourgeoisie knows this very well and occasionally says so through the mouths of some of its representatives, as we highlighted in a last letter on the fetish of markets. The bourgeoisie also has class consciousness in its own way. Any material movement is infinitely more universal than a movement of ideas, says the usual Marx. As can be seen, we are not cut out to invent new classes. Our not being indifferent to anything that happens in the world stems from this very fact, because any movement that tends towards the destruction of the present state of affairs is at the same time, we were about to say, like true concretists, a movement towards communism. Marx is more radical. He does not say that every movement etc. towards communism is revolutionary. He says he calls every real movement that overcomes the present state of affairs communism. Even in language it is easy to slip into clichés. And anyone who thinks that communism is a certain type of society to be achieved will end up acting outside the material determinants, relying on commonplaces borrowed from past generations of communism, refusing to adhere to forces that emanate from society and thus aligning themselves with ideas that do not represent the already observed conservation-revolution dialectic. If this dialectic is missing, quoting Marx versus Proudhon, all that remains is conservation. It is no coincidence that in the text we mentioned earlier, Property and Capital, the chapter Utopia, Science and Action is emphasized. Prophesying a future or wanting to realize a future are both inadequate positions for communists. This is replaced by the history of the class struggle seen as a unitary course, of which at each contingent moment only one part has already been played out, and the other is awaited. The data of the subsequent course is just as fundamental and indispensable as that of the past course. The problem of party praxis is not to know the future, which would be little, nor to want the future, which would be too much, but to preserve the line of the future of one's own class. The communist movement is not a question of pure doctrine, it is not a question of pure will. However, the defect of doctrine paralyzes it. The defect of will paralyzes it. And defect means absorption of other doctrines, of other wills. The defect of doctrine can lead either to an overestimation or an underestimation of the will. Are we going to look for the right middle way? Not a chance. In this we are extremists, since we are communists, and communists are by definition those who represent the future, i.e. the possibility of the overthrow of praxis, which is the expression of the maximum of will. We remain firm in reaffirming that the communist is always the representative of the maximum of will. On one condition, that he is truly in harmony with the historical party. In this case he will be aware of the fact that it is material conditions that determine what the maximum of will can be expressed in different historical epochs. It therefore does not depend on us. It is not up to communists to create the formal party. They must not adopt the attitude of those who have bought a ticket to the spectacle of revolution and want a place in the grandstand. There is an inflation of self-styled communists who feel they have a marshal's baton in their pocket and don't even know what the Gavetta is. Perhaps the proletariat will be able to achieve its first results after this counter-revolutionary wave when it begins to kick the shit out of every little person who believes himself to be the godfather, creator of parties and revolutions. We do not think it is difficult to understand that today the maximum amount of will that can be expressed by communists may be the minimum compared to other situations. We have mentioned the birth of the modern proletarian struggle through formulas of conservation. We have seen that the latter represented at the same time, dialectically, forms of negation of the present society. We have seen how Owen was the first representative of the synthesis of this material process which, in the passage from the ideal model to revolutionary praxis, forces the man, the fighter Owen to the foundation of the workers' union organization. Inevitable, the purpose gives itself the appropriate instruments, and the only instrument that enables workers to fight as a class against the opposing class is the trade union. Then comes the party. That is the story. And today? Trade union and party are familiar tools. They were born, degenerated, resurrected, or caged in the logic of capital. In short, there has been and there will still be a movement to have this society as it is and, according to Marx's formulation, which starts from there to establish that communism is to be identified in that process and not elsewhere, at the same time to change it. Perhaps we are beginning to get a glimpse that the catchphrase, doing the analysis of the concrete situation, has somewhat deeper implications than is normally believed by the petty father creators of parties and situations. On the one hand, we certainly cannot get an idea of the material course of events by just reading the newspapers or watching TV. The bourgeoisie offer the representation of their world through an analysis of the situation based on their ideology, interests, and struggles within their class. This happens not only because their journalists are paid to say what they say. The whole mechanism of communication is a superstructure and, together with the development of the productive forces and the mode of production that are holding them back, it offers us a mirror of the bourgeois world as it is. On the other hand, we can only investigate, we have seen, just the world as it is. And so there are no saints. To see what we need in this blessed concrete analysis of the situation, we have to treat with things and thoughts at a higher level of abstraction than bourgeois newspapers and television can offer us. We do not, however, start from scratch. We know that Marx teaches us to think in terms of the specific, concrete properties of capitalism. If we were talking about dinosaurs, perhaps, maybe, the law of value would not be needed, but if we were talking about capitalist society, yes. So we say, at the basis of all present society, such as it is the law of value. Nice statement. Our critics rub their hands together. Here are the abstractionists. They say, easy, eh? But once you have said this, then what do you do? Some very concrete numbers. We do not flinch at all. If we were to descend to the level of vulgar conceptions about society, we too would say, with the old popular proverb, that from saying to doing there is a sea in between. But we are calling our comrades to work on a terrain that is not of this world, neither folk wisdom nor the everyday treatment of vulgar economics helps us. If one has to interpret the current situation, one cannot just interpret what one sees, otherwise we would be philosophers and everyone would have a different answer. Science, on the other hand, is characterized by the fact that it gives valid answers for everyone and shuts up anyone who cannot prove otherwise. However, since laboratory experiments cannot be performed with society, proof must come from past experience and present conditions. We do not need philosophical interpretation, which is subjective. We need real change in society as it was and as it is today. We need data of the objective situation. In this we are therefore sure to be more concrete than all the concretists. We open the newspaper and turn on the television. We read and see nothing but men talking about themselves and their relations with other men. In Albania there are men who move, who shoot, who hold up governments and who go on more or less military missions. In Africa there are millions of men moving around driven by conflicts that are difficult to qualify and quantify. In Italy, everyone has their say on parameters, stalwarts, new constitutional arrangements and ridiculous secessions. Let us stop in Italy. What does the law of value have to do with the opposing declarations of a Fossa, a Faccio, a Prodi or a Bossi? To do our operation we have little data because the bourgeoisie does not give us the pleasure of providing the figures we would like, and to quantify some of our categories on the basis of bourgeois data would be truly arduous. Obtaining the amount of constant capital in a cycle is practically impossible. We immediately get lost in the figures on depreciation, investments, assets, etc. The same applies to variable capital. We would have to separate productive labor from unproductive labor, to analyze within the productive sectors themselves what the boundaries are between sterile services and those useful to production, between production proper and administration, and so on. But we do have some basic data. One of these data is the so-called gross domestic product or national income or, if we want to put it in our terms, quantity of value produced ex novo in a cycle. Since the bourgeoisie makes its calculations every year, we will say that it is the quantity of value produced ex novo in a year. In order to make a concrete analysis of the concrete Italian situation, we can start from this certain datum. Obviously it is expressed in prices and not in value, but we know that at the level of this great aggregate the sum of prices is equal to the sum of values. Good. Those who have bought this week's Economic World have seen that there is an insert on the national budget, from which we read the following figures for 95. Rounding off the figures, we have a value produced ex novo of 1,700,000 billion lire, which is divided into 1 million billion lire that went to profit and 700,000 billion lire that went to labor power. From the latter figure, we subtract what statistics classify as the wages of the non-market service workers, i.e. teachers, military personnel, policemen, administrative staff, etc. It would be necessary, as we have said, to subtract more, but we do not have sufficient data and so we make do, assuming that the income of the workers employed in the hidden productive economy is equivalent to the income of the unproductive nested in industry. However arbitrary this operation may be, we will see that the results are still useful for our little demonstration. Let us then remove the income of the unproductive ones from the total number of employees, 200,000 billion, to be added to the profit share, surplus value, as this is a simple distribution of wealth. With this shift, which we need in order to arrive at a delimitation according to our rules, we thus have 1,200,000 billion of surplus value profit versus 500,000 billion. Total surplus value divided by the total value of the productive labor force equals the rate of exploitation equals 240%. In Italy, therefore, a productive worker works, out of 8 hours, 5 hours and 40 minutes for capital and 2 hours and 20 minutes for himself. What does this have to do with analyzing the concrete situation? A little patience. For now, we have come to the conclusion that the general exploitation essay in Italy has roughly risen historically by 2.5 times the essay taken as a model by Marx. In more than a century of development of the productive forces, this would be nothing extraordinary. Let us now move on from the general example to a particular one, so as to please all those who like to go into specifics. A small company that we know well because we had to do the accounts in its pocket, had a turnover of 42 billion and 130 employees who cost, all in all, not even 4 billion. Between raw materials, components, supplier expenses, advertising and building rent it spent another 4 billion. Fixed assets a pittance, desks, cabinets, shelves, some 30 computers and their software, 100 million in annual depreciation. Warehouse input-output managed by the just-in-time method, so minimal stocks and zero finished products. Taking into account that this company was offloading profits onto a couple of fictitious foreign subsidiaries, 3 others were, however, in strong surplus, we are at 400% profit ratio, 32/8. Subtracting 4 billion in constant capital, we arrive at an 800% exploitation rate of 32/4. This company, which touted itself as a jewel of new technology, was not one of the most efficient in its field and was crushed by the competition after only a few years. This proves that there are companies that are even more competitive, hence higher productivity, hence higher exploitation rates. We know that Benetton inaugurated a fully automatic factory last year, bringing back to Italy the processes it had scattered abroad. The group has a turnover of 7,000 billion lire. What will be the United Colors exploitation essay? The same for Luxottica, eyewear, again in the same area, for Panto, doors and windows, and other highly automated factories that now produce for the whole world. To go into specifics. Now, however, the left teaches us that one cannot make a brutally statistical analysis of the whole of society to draw particular conclusions. On the other hand, it teaches us that one cannot make a count in the pocket of an individual capitalist to draw general conclusions. One must make a class account. That is, take the figures, but use them according to our own categories, not simply according to bourgeois categories. That is, we need to do another small operation to actually understand what is happening within the entire proletarian class. As far as the bourgeoisie is concerned, the thing is quite simple. Whoever receives surplus value directly, we can safely classify him in the bourgeois class. As far as the other classes are concerned, it is more nuanced. If we delimited the sets representing the proletariat, the half classes and the underproletariat, we would have overlaps between the pure sets. However, we are not so much interested in the details of the nuances as in the fact that these nuances exist. If we want to cut to the chase, since we need to analyze the concrete situation with concrete methods in order to know concretely what we want to do, we have to rough it out and understand what proletariat actually means from a general class point of view. So, the left helps us, in a couple of threads of time, to understand how to deal with the situation of fuzzy sets. We must define a particular class, the proletariat, according to its determinations to be opposed to capital. This means first putting the productive workers in industry, trade, and services all together. Then add the unemployed and those seeking their first job. Then the large ranks of the unemployed in general. We can derive the figures directly from the data provided by the bourgeoisie. In Italy there are 57 million inhabitants. In terms of employment, this country is truly the most modern in the world, very few work and many live off the work of others. No other country has such a relative overpopulation. Out of a population of 57 million, only 22 million, 38%, are employed, which is a very low percentage compared to the largest industrial countries, which instead have a share of the working population approaching and in some cases exceeding 50%. The number of productive workers, according to the criterion we have adopted, corresponds to exactly half of the employed, i.e. 11 million. If we want to go into detail, we have 4.9 million in industry, 0.6 million in agriculture, 5.5 million in saleable services. We immediately see an interesting fact: the number of people employed in industry is much lower than in productive services, and we should take into account that within industry there are non-productive services that are not recorded in the statistics. If we took this into account, the results we want to achieve would be more pronounced. We are therefore making a demonstration with a large margin of safety. The mass of surplus value produced in a cycle eventually turns out to come from very few who are engaged in productive activities and is distributed to too many who are beneficiaries. The distribution of surplus value within Italian society is quite interesting and leads us to make a consideration. Those who have read our notebook on accumulation will at some point recall the figure in which the parabola of surplus value is plotted. This curve represents the magnitude of surplus value as a function of the workers employed, i.e. as a function of labor productivity. Historically, the increase in labor productivity results in a contradiction. While the surplus value extorted from a single worker increases, the possibility of extorting more surplus value from many workers decreases. This absolute decrease represented in the diagram is compensated for by the enlargement of the scale of production, enlarged reproduction, and thus there is a degree of indeterminacy with respect to the possibility of predicting when and how the mechanism might jam in a finite world that cannot know infinite capitalist growth. The symmetry inherent in the shape of the curve, symmetry in the design, and in the opposite meaning of the two zeros we find at the extremes, indicates to us that the apex of the parabola, i.e. the maximum of surplus value as a function of the number of workers, is when society expresses a surplus value SA of 100% or, put another way, when the average social working day of 8 hours is divided into 4 hours of necessary labor and 4 of surplus labor. In the text, we combine this fact, formally expressed, with the observation that at this precise point, the system reaches its maximum output. The observation we make now is this: we have a production system that over time increases its strength, and increases the number of goods produced by putting more and more capital into motion with fewer and fewer men. So if we were to move a significant point on the parabola according to the passage of time, we should have a path, let us say historical, from zero surplus value represented by the maximum number of workers in a society that consumes everything it produces, to the zero surplus value represented by a society without workers that produces everything with robots. If we assume a surplus value rate of 240% as the one indicated for the Italian production system in 1996, we find ourselves faced with a considerable deviation from the peak of maximum output. That is, we find ourselves far towards the zero surplus value of the hypothetical limit point at which productivity is infinite, the mass of production being entirely obtained without workers. Both our notebook and the above-mentioned threads of time make it clear that our formalizations have a social character, i.e. they are an expression of the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the working class. Thus we can assume that the curve represents a social trend. In this regard, Marx notes that there are well-identified countertrends that make the law of tendency reversible. One of these countertrends is the development of branches of production with a low organic composition of capital, i.e. branches in which the tendency of high machinist productivity is reversed and high rates of exploitation with a conspicuous use of cheap labor power are used instead. This is also necessary because, as Marx points out, in the great commodity-producing society there is also the problem of the great sale of commodities, otherwise surplus value remains in its potential state and cannot return in the form of capital to the next cycle. This is consistent with the fact that in the steps that determine the parabola of surplus value, one of the fundamental factors is the mass of consumer goods, expressed in the text in dimensionless units of product, that go to reconstitute labor power. The value of these consumer goods stands in inverse relation to labor productivity. This is why it is very important for capitalists to sell a very large quantity of commodities in order to make up for the decrease in unit value, but this is incompatible with the formation of an ever-increasing unemployed humanity unable to consume. Let us remember that we are following the thread through the theory of value in order to come to conclusions about certain social effects ascertainable in the daily news reported by newspapers and TV, news that in itself does not offer any enlightenment as to the reasons that provoke events in politics and the economy. Following the example of the aforementioned texts, we have tried to make, on the basis of the available data, what is called in them the class account. The first question we want to answer is this: are we not, by chance, faced with a kind of antagonistic cause blocking the drop in output in the world of production? Let us base ourselves on a datum provided by Marx. The increase in productivity results in a plethora of capital, a direct consequence of the plethora of commodities. This plethora must be reabsorbed, otherwise we are faced with a catastrophic crisis. Faced with this phenomenon, the bourgeoisie has devised a series of expedients that generally go by the name of Keynesianism and which have represented, as we have said many times, therapies to reanimate the capitalist corpse. Lately, the bourgeoisie has realized that these expedients are no longer effective and is caught between the need to sustain production by cutting the costs of the old policies and, as Prodi says, the need to eliminate the economy's woes without killing it. We do our class account. If, as mentioned, we make the class count, we must broadly incorporate into a large whole all those we call the unemployed. These are the productive wage earners, 11 million, the unproductive service workers, 4.3 million, and the unemployed, 2.7 million. In total, 18 million people of working age make up the large class set. Here again we round up and down, assuming that the 300,000 policemen, carabinieri, and financiers are compensated by the same number of undeclared workers who do not appear in the statistics and who, according to an official assessment, would produce at least 25% of the GDP to be added to the national accounts figure. In any case, we are interested in orders of magnitude and not in exact figures that we will never be able to deduce statistically. In fact, we cannot start arguing about the position of an industrial manager who appears among the wage earners or about the unemployed person who sets up his own business by applying for a VAT number and thus appears among the professionals. Compared to the total number of employed persons, which is 22 million, we have by difference for million members of the bourgeoisie and the small entrepreneurship of the middle classes. With this new subdivision to which we refer the figures in the usual national count, we now have that the 4 millionaire bourgeoisie receive an income of 835,000 billion lire, almost exactly half of the total income, 1,700,000 billion lire. These few figures tell us that, if we do the maths in the productive sectors, we have an average exploitation SA of 240%, with peaks of even more than 800%, as shown in the example above, while if we do the maths from the point of view of the general relationship between classes, we have an average exploitation SA of 100%. This means that, within society, the bourgeoisie government has been forced to take measures to distribute surplus value in order to avoid the total impoverishment of a large part of the population, with the associated collapse of production. As an immediate result, a bunch of bourgeois, taken individually, having had a part of their profits taken away from them without having a chance to understand that this was done in the general interest of their class, started a movement to recover the alleged ill-gotten gains. What does the individual capitalist care about the distribution of surplus value within society? Capitalism as a whole has created the need for it, but the individual capitalist doesn't want to know. It is enough for him that his goods reach the market and turn into cash, business profit, as soon as possible, and he does not care how others can have their pockets full of money to buy them. If the bourgeois class were aware of capitalist mechanisms, this would result in the expression of strong governments capable of distributing surplus value more rationally and efficiently in society. This road has already been taken with the fascisms of the 1920s and 1930s which, in various ways, from America to Russia via Europe, sought to socially reorganize the state. But the bourgeois class is made up of many capitalists who have no understanding of the need for the state to function as a collective capitalist in order to safeguard the general interests of capital, even if this means affecting particular interests. The anarchy of their mode of production is reflected in the heads of the individual bourgeois, and they have no intention of giving up a large share of surplus value for purposes they cannot conceive of. So, returning to the characters already named, the industrialist's representative Fosse will demand, on behalf of his members, an economic policy favorable to the non-division of surplus value, while the head of the executive Prodi on the one hand will have to agree with him, coming into conflict with the needs of the system, and on the other will have to safeguard the needs of the system, coming into conflict with both the industrialists and the proletariat. The governor of the Bank of Italy, Faccio, will have to make it clear to everyone that anyone, once in government, will have to take the same measures, and the leader of the Lega Bossi will have to represent the interests of those who, squeezed between the big bourgeoisie and the proletariat, can no longer stand that any government has to do the same things over and over again. As can be seen, there are symptoms of that preservation of achievements that cannot be defended except by blowing up the entire system. And there are also clear demonstrations that the material prepared by this society as it is more than sufficient for the activity of revolutionary militants without setting out in search of windmills to assail. What we mean is that the preparation necessary for the formation and development of the proletarian party should at least begin with an understanding of what is really happening in the world, and that the action of revolutionaries should be in tune with what is really happening so as to be able to anticipate the future as Marx already demands in the manifesto. We cited a very concrete social situation, the one everyone is talking about today, northeastern Italy. Here we have an immediate perception of the individual or collective reaction of people who have achieved results and do not want to lose them. It is a good terrain for so-called situation analyses. We can represent concreteness through the mechanisms of the law of value and draw conclusions from it. Here the communists must say whether we are in the presence of material facts concerning the revolutionary movement. We are not interested in whether Bossi takes the ampoule to the Po or makes his antiterroni rants by wrapping himself in Alberto da Giussano's flag. Nor are we interested in judging a movement by what that movement says about itself. We may well laugh about it, but in the meantime we have learned from the Marxist method that there are concrete situations within society that can be represented through our schemata. It must be possible to make projections into the future on all this. We already have, therefore, an embryo of an answer as to what the phenomenon of the League may be and what it may represent. Perhaps the League as such will disappear shortly, but the material reasons that made it come into being, develop and act against the ties represented by the existing against the development of the productive forces will not disappear. The League is a crude stab at severing the bonds that capital finds within itself, but mocking its distasteful manifestations is not a good indication of analytical ability. Maybe Bossi is ridiculous, he says stupid things, but looking through him we can easily see that it is increasingly difficult to preserve the existing without breaking something. Has it ever been seen before that an electioneering, populist parliamentary democratic party has thrown about 90 possible deputies overboard over a matter of principle? What forces drive the League to a bull in the China shop policy? Let us try to make a projection into the future, trying to understand what could happen in a country like Italy, if the state could not give an answer to the ghosts that agitate the Bossi, if the executive were unable to make decisions nailed as it is to the numbers of electoral democracy, if the mechanisms that Marx identified once and for all in 18 Brumaire were once again set in motion. And Marx has already answered once and for all, well dug up old mole. We should develop the issues surrounding all these what-ifs further and see if by chance they might not turn into a when. Of course, for those of us in this room, perhaps this discourse is understandable, but for almost all of us speaking Arabic, we know that the entire left linked to civil society, millions of people, had only marched because Berlusconi had formed a right-wing government. And we also see Bertinotti, with Stalinists and Trotskyists, elegantly participating in a left government that is doing worse than Berlusconi could have done. Even Bossi has shown that he is not tied to that fistful of lentils represented by the government cadre. It is not a moral judgment, ours, and, if as far as the aforementioned characters are concerned, the discourse is obvious, there are many leftists who, in order to enter the movement, are eager to dish out tactical novelties, to be very concrete and not to be bypassed, as they say. The fact is that when one does not evaluate the facts according to the laws that Marx discovered, but according to the storm of ideas that is unleashed in the moments of emotions, every concept of tactics goes out the window and one adopts other people's theories, other people's wills, as mentioned. Haven't we seen the gritty and masochistic heroes of the social centers, those same ones who went to clash with the trade union traitors at every demonstration, parading singing Bella Ciao against the fascist Avak or arm in arm with their enemies? This is the environment, this is what society as it is offers us on a daily basis. It is not our job to be agreeable to this society and its representatives. No communist should make the mistake of showing himself as what he is not just to make himself understood, to feel immersed in the so-called movement. We are inside the movement in another way, with our work, to act as a detector, as Amadeo called himself, to see if there are any communists who will come and work with us on the terrain of the manifesto, a formidable demarcating shear between the devotees of this society and the anticipators of the future one. And that is action. Anxious search for new utopias. Is the action that of the capitalist Fossa, who organizes a demonstration, for now virtual but with thousands of other capitalists online, against capitalism that expropriates capitalists, not ours, aimed at wrenching militants out of the catchphrase, the commonplace? We well believe that Fossa is concerned. We do not know if the tax burden on corporate profits is really 70% as he says. But certainly if his company is one that has an 800% exploitation rate, he will certainly not like to be tied to a system that has a general rate of 8 times less and that in the eyes of the individual takes without apparently offering anything. Especially if his market is North Central Europe, which pays in marks and does not ask for internal allocations of surplus value. But Fossa is a real capitalist, not like Bossi who plays the politician representing a middle class. Fossa doesn't break glassware, he goes to the notary to have the borders of the conquered territory cadastrated because he wants to preserve his conquests. Only the notary, the collective capitalist state, wants the fee to ensure that all capitalists do not tear each other apart and destroy the economy. Moreover, it knows that every single capitalist is a competitor of every other and that the game of free competition has as its natural outlet the monopoly. It is obvious that in Italy every capitalist who is not part of the few families that count is penalized, even Agnelli, absolute monopolist of the automobile, wants to preserve his conquests. Fiat has more say than Fossa's little factory. The result is that the collective capitalist state, in distributing surplus value in society so that it continues to function, can only take away where there is abundance and put in where there is shortage. Thus it happens that Fiat, partly because it has a low profit rate, partly because it has influence, receives state subsidies instead of promising industries that would need them. To the modern bourgeois observer, as to the old reformist overtaken by fascism, all this appears as a problem of a more just and rational distribution of surplus value within society. The Rifkin, Ruffolo, De Benedetti and Mink, to name but a few people we have studied, then appear, theorizing a world no longer based on guarantees of employment and assistance, but on a total freedom granted to the islands of surplus value production, which should be matched by a rational use of surplus value in the rest of society, either by the state or by willing citizens devoted to non-profitable activities, ranging from caring for the elderly to managing the artistic heritage. These new utopias, examples of which we have collected in past work, are ideologically further back than the old utopias with which we began this exhibition, for the simple reason that they aim at an impossible capitalism without contradictions. Old history, but equally interesting, because the call for this new utopianism, out of date twice over, has the merit of showing us precisely the need to break the constraints on the further development of the productive forces precisely in an attempt to preserve the system that creates and renews those constraints. Once again, we see that the action of communists cannot be marked by archaic representations of society, by Stalinist brand socialist realism, even if it is anti-Stalinist. Rifkin and Ruffolo are telling us, without knowing it, that this society is overripe to fully explode the energy of its liberated productive forces and that a very small part of the social labor dispersed today can suffice to satisfy human needs, while the rest can vent itself in new fields unimaginable today. In recent days, a commemoration of the economist Federico Caff has appeared in the newspapers. He was a humanist Keynesian, convinced that surplus value could be distributed within society using human methods, transforming capitalism from within. Some 15 years ago he wrote an article in the manifesto, no, it has nothing to do with Marx, entitled La solitudine del riformista, the loneliness of the reformist, in which he said he preferred the little to the whole and what was achievable rather than what was utopian. But when it comes to capitalism, it is precisely what seems attainable that is utopian. When Taylor at the turn of the century laid the foundations for the scientific organization of labor, he envisaged a wonderful world made possible by mass production. Between the wars, Keynes was truly convinced that humanity had found a way to live happily by producing and consuming. And the same was true in the 1960s, when the Kant school spread honey milk in profusion with its theories of infinite exponential growth. Even political activists prefer the little to the whole and what is achievable to utopias. But they are so impractical that they learn nothing from trivial experience. What is realizable for them is never realized, and it must be so frustrating to experience continual failure. Instead, the action of the Marxist revolutionary finds substantial confirmation in communism that changes the present state of affairs. For it is part of another school. Instead of the unhinged agitation of the fleeting moment, for him the inevitable revolt against the shackles to the development of the productive forces is fundamental, and therefore to be cherished. Agreed, we also do everything else, distribute leaflets, participate in or organize demonstrations and strikes where we are and can, etc. But from the general perspective of what is really going on, we ask ourselves, if it is true that humanity does not want to lose what it has achieved, is it not wriggling in the extreme contradiction of the union of opposites, conservation-destruction? Be that as it may, in this conservative destructive action, men tend to unleash the productive forces, which find themselves even more enchained. We have seen the transition from utopia to the science of prediction on material data. Of course, we have come to this using only an infinitesimal fragment of Marxist theory, but it should be enough for us to realize that consequent action, praxis, cannot be on a foreign plane. Even the praxis of revolutionaries is subject to historical processes. Marx in the manifesto advanced a 10-point program, many of which no longer make sense today. The highly progressive tax has long been law, state control, if not monopoly, of banks is a fact, transport and energy are public, free public education for children is there. The realization of first revolutionary and then reformist demands is a historical fact and does not oblige Marxists to insist on it. Political campaigning is also subject to the same determinations. When Lenin warmly pushed the campaign to denounce Tsarist society, there was no television, and above all there was not the degenerate political struggle of today that uses denunciation campaigns in the war between bourgeois factions. Even the trade union struggle no longer involves any defense of the existing organizations, which are now fully integrated into the bourgeois machinery. We are forced to work in the world that is there and not in the one we would like, but that is not why we defend it. The importance of the trade union terrain is as valid for us as it was for Lenin, but certainly the bourgeoisie has also removed the trade union from the wide range of instruments available. It is not for the working class to complain because the bourgeoisie is eliminating the instruments of defense within this society one by one. Only Panella wants more representative democracy, but for the proletariat it has not been a subject of claim for a century. No one today could mourn the destruction of these trade unions. The proletariat would set up others if they were needed, or else be forced to dispense with immediate claims to make the leap into the political battle for power. For the communist to criticize the union makes no more sense than to criticize a bourgeois, only in front of the workers, and for specific facts does it make sense to denounce the shenanigans, and our direct experiences prove that the opportunist the more he is the more he theorizes that the workers don't understand. All bullshit, the workers understand just fine. But these are still small things compared to the immense task of the communists, that of representing an environment absolutely hostile to all that is capitalist, the only resource for not being homologated among the chains that bind the explosion of the social productive force towards a new form. It is from this environment that the overthrow of praxis will be possible when it is demanded by the revolutionary movement. A party that is organic to the movement for the destruction of the present may be organic to a mass movement, but to imagine the overthrow of praxis linked to the activism of individuals or groups is simply nonsense. With this kind of attitude many people think they are in line with the theory-practice relationship, let's do this and this so we will have these and these other results. As if links with the masses could be willed. The left has taught us that this fallacy is precisely what fools militants away from the possibility of the party. There can be no overthrow of praxis when there is not the complete scheme of all the elements linked into a single reality, material drives, class relations, party formation and development, the reciprocal and contrary influence of bourgeois ideology and communism, etc. Anyone who would think of overthrowing the praxis with only the instrument of a small group and the will of a few militants without everything else being in place at the same time would not only be outside Marxism, but also a little sick with unconscious megalomania. Hopefully our small contribution today will make it clear to comrades why Marx's theory, based on the law of value, is catastrophic. If we may borrow terms from the theory of catastrophes, a recent branch of bourgeois science, we would say that there will be no morphogenesis, i.e. birth of new form, as long as the structural stability of the old form is not affected. Now, this stability is guaranteed by only one factor, as our small example above confirms, the ever-increasing extortion of surplus value and its distribution to that part of society that consumes more and more of it without producing any. The left called this phenomenon by the name of the greatest break on the further impetus of Russia's productive forces in the Stalin era, kolkhozianism. The kolkhozniks were peasants bound to paltry interests, to the farmyard and henhouse economy. The distribution of existence guarantees to the unreserved in the most developed countries is industrial kolkhozianism. Much more than in the past, the struggle for the social distribution of surplus value is therefore the basis of the coming social movements. The praxis? To exist, to make ourselves known, to make better use of these instruments of investigation, to involve other militants, etc., so that we do not one day capitulate, like the overwhelming majority, in the face of capital's demands, and perhaps demand in the face of a strong bourgeois executive, truly progressive, i.e. super-fascist, the defense of the democratic space is lost. Those who do not cling with all their might to Marxist analysis fuck up praxis and side with the adversary at decisive moments. We already know this, the history of the revolutionary movement is a teacher. Those who have a democratic view of revolution will defend democracy against revolution, those who have a pacifist view of the military question will go to war as soon as they are offered a just cause, those who believe they are making the revolution will do something else when the revolution is, unbeknownst to them, those who believe they are the most important individual in the world will be left by the revolution to be the individual and will be neglected by the coveted masses. Now we are still at the small manifestations of episodes to which few attach importance. The power of recent technologies has not yet been fully expressed, just as the effects of the collapse of the East are not yet fully defined. A new generation faces our propaganda and is insensitive to the sclerotic language of old politics, while Marxism freed from degenerate encrustations presents itself loud and clear to ears that are not degenerate. We do not want to come to hasty conclusions, but we think we have identified a trend, a general tendency in today's capitalism, from which we expect, especially from young people, a greater understanding of Marxism as the science of society. and therefore we also expect a broadening of the organic work around these themes, which are mentioned today, the only way to achieve higher results.